Hello dreamers, and welcome to Haunted Sleep. This is the place where eerie tales and calming whispers meet, helping you drift into peaceful sleep with a touch of mystery. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Leave a comment below and let me know. And if you're enjoying these nightly journeys, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell, so you never miss a night of chilling calm. Now, close your eyes, get comfortable, and let's drift into the unknown together. About 13 years ago, my mother bought an older house in Hillsdale, New York. It's a beautiful Greek Revival home, about 175 years old. The previous owners had used it as a vacation home, but my mom and I decided to move in full time. My son had just been born with severe health problems, so I was spending a lot of time at the hospital. In fact, I didn't actually spend the night in the house until about a month after we moved in. The first day I was home alone, I was in a small room off the dining room that we used as an office. I was on the internet and talking to a friend on the phone when I started hearing a strange beeping noise coming from the kitchen. It was a fast, high-pitched, continuous beep. I went into the kitchen to see what it was, and found the digital clock on the stove going crazy. The dial on the clock, which you had to turn to set the time, was spinning on its own, even though it wasn't actually moving. I checked around the house to see if there were any electrical issues, but everything else seemed fine. The lights were working, my computer was running, and nothing else seemed out of place. Yet the clock kept beeping. After a few minutes, I started to feel uneasy, so I told my friend I'd call her back. I left the house, walked to the store down the block, and took my time. When I returned, the clock was working normally, and it never beeped again. Several months later, my husband and I were spending the night in the house. My mother was asleep upstairs, and my husband and I were in that same office room, folding laundry. Suddenly, we heard a woman's voice clearly say, "Hello?" from the dining room. We both jumped, and without saying much, we decided to go to bed. On my way upstairs, I checked on my mom to make sure she was okay. She was sound asleep, so I knew it wasn't her. Around the same time, I started to feel a presence upstairs, especially on the landing. Late at night, if I got up to use the bathroom, I would have this strong feeling that someone was coming toward the door. I would have to wait a few minutes for the sensation to pass before I could walk down the hall. It wasn't a feeling of fear, just a nagging sense that I wasn't alone. A couple of years later, my husband was gone, and I was staying with my mother in the back bedroom, which overlooked the garden. One afternoon, while my mom and I were outside with a friend, she suddenly asked, "Who's in your room?" We all looked, but no one was there. My mom said it must have been a trick of the light. But just a few minutes later, the window she'd seen someone through slammed shut. The room was pitch black at night, except for a night light, which I eventually had to take out. It would turn on for a minute, then off for a minute, as if there was a short in the wiring. One night, while lying in the dark, I saw a small, bright white light zoom out of the corner of the room near the ceiling. It floated around for a moment, then zoomed out the door. I initially thought it was a lightning bug, but then I realized that fireflies are yellowish. They flash on and off, and they are much slower. Another time, I was sweeping the front bedroom and bent over to use the dustpan. My back was to the door that led to the landing. My shirt rode up, and I felt something brush across my lower back. It felt like a cat's tail, but there were no cats around, and it would have been too high for a cat to brush across my back. During all this time, my mother never experienced anything unusual. She didn't really believe there was anything supernatural in the house, although she was open-minded about the paranormal. I did notice, though, that when I stood at the top of the stairs, I often felt dizzy. My mom had even fallen down the stairs a couple of times, and our pets would often sit in the hall and stare up at the top of the stairs as if something was up there. My mom decided to renovate the kitchen, dining room, and small office, and that's when things seemed to ramp up. One evening, we were downstairs watching TV, and the dog and the cat were both in the room. Suddenly, there was a huge bang from upstairs. We all jumped, and after a few minutes, I finally worked up the courage to go upstairs. I found a box of Christmas ornaments in the middle of the landing. The box had been on the bed in the back bedroom, about 15 feet away. It was as if something had picked it up and tossed it. After that, we had a talk with the spirit, explaining that the house was being renovated and that we hoped she would like the final result. Afterward, things quieted down. Later, we found out that an older woman had once lived in the house, confined to the back bedroom. She had passed away there about 50 years ago. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. About 13 years ago, my mother bought an older house in Hillsdale, New York. It's a beautiful Greek revival home, about 175 years old. The previous owners had used it as a vacation home, but my mom and I decided to move in full time. My son had just been born with severe health problems, so I was spending a lot of time at the hospital. In fact, I didn't actually spend the night in the house until about a month after we moved in. The first day I was home alone, I was in a small room off the dining room that we used as an office. I was on the internet and talking to a friend on the phone when I started hearing a strange beeping noise coming from the kitchen. It was a fast, high-pitched, continuous beep. I went into the kitchen to see what it was, and found the digital clock on the stove going crazy. The dial on the clock, which you had to turn to set the time, was spinning on its own, even though it wasn't actually moving. I checked around the house to see if there were any electrical issues, but everything else seemed fine. The lights were working, my computer was running, and nothing else seemed out of place. Yet the clock kept beeping. After a few minutes, I started to feel uneasy, so I told my friend I'd call her back. I left the house, walked to the store down the block, and took my time. When I returned, the clock was working normally, and it never beeped again. Several months later, my husband and I were spending the night in the house. My mother was asleep upstairs, and my husband and I were in that same office room, folding laundry. Suddenly, we heard a woman's voice clearly say, "Hello?" from the dining room. We both jumped, and without saying much, we decided to go to bed. On my way upstairs, I checked on my mom to make sure she was okay. She was sound asleep, so I knew it wasn't her. Around the same time, I started to feel a presence upstairs, especially on the landing. Late at night, if I got up to use the bathroom, I would have this strong feeling that someone was coming toward the door. I would have to wait a few minutes for the sensation to pass before I could walk down the hall. It wasn't a feeling of fear, just a nagging sense that I wasn't alone. A couple of years later, my husband was gone, and I was staying with my mother in the back bedroom, which overlooked the garden. One afternoon, while my mom and I were outside with a friend, she suddenly asked, "Who's in your room?" We all looked, but no one was there. My mom said it must have been a trick of the light. But just a few minutes later, the window she'd seen someone through slammed shut. The room was pitch black at night, except for a night light, which I eventually had to take out. It would turn on for a minute, then off for a minute, as if there was a short in the wiring. One night, while lying in the dark, I saw a small, bright white light zoom out of the corner of the room near the ceiling. It floated around for a moment, then zoomed out the door. I initially thought it was a lightning bug, but then I realized that fireflies are yellowish. They flash on and off, and they are much slower. Another time, I was sweeping the front bedroom and bent over to use the dustpan. My back was to the door that led to the landing. My shirt rode up, and I felt something brush across my lower back. It felt like a cat's tail, but there were no cats around, and it would have been too high for a cat to brush across my back. During all this time, my mother never experienced anything unusual. She didn't really believe there was anything supernatural in the house, although she was open-minded about the paranormal. I did notice, though, that when I stood at the top of the stairs, I often felt dizzy. My mom had even fallen down the stairs a couple of times, and our pets would often sit in the hall and stare up at the top of the stairs as if something was up there. My mom decided to renovate the kitchen, dining room, and small office, and that's when things seemed to ramp up. One evening, we were downstairs watching TV, and the dog and the cat were both in the room. Suddenly, there was a huge bang from upstairs. We all jumped, and after a few minutes, I finally worked up the courage to go upstairs. I found a box of Christmas ornaments in the middle of the landing. The box had been on the bed in the back bedroom, about 15 feet away. It was as if something had picked it up and tossed it. After that, we had a talk with the spirit, explaining that the house was being renovated and that we hoped she would like the final result. Afterward, things quieted down. Later, we found out that an older woman had once lived in the house, confined to the back bedroom. She had passed away there about 50 years ago. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. I live with my disabled husband in a building specifically for seniors and people with disabilities. The building has been around for over 40 years, and given its long history, it's not surprising that it's quite active, like a hospital or nursing home might be. There are a lot of sick and dying people who have lived here, and many still do. The building is located in a small town in upstate New York, right on the banks of the Erie Canal, an area rich with history. One of the most famous nearby sites is Beardsley Castle, known for its paranormal activity. To give you an idea of the layout, I used to live in an apartment at the front of the building, but now my husband and I live in a different one. Over the years, we've experienced numerous strange events, some of which I still can't explain. It started with things like footsteps. I would often hear someone walking from the door to the bedroom and back, or from the bedroom to the bathroom, followed by the sound of water running. I would also see faint images of a man and a woman walking around the apartment. These figures were never fully visible, but they were definitely there. On many nights, my husband and I would be sitting at our computers, and we'd both feel a tap on the shoulder or a hand on the back of our necks, like someone was standing right behind us. Sometimes the cats would act weird, and I'd just assume it was them. But other times, I couldn't explain what was happening. One of the more dramatic occurrences happened while I was sitting in our recliner, watching TV and crocheting. My husband was on his computer, and both of our cats were curled up on the chair with me. Suddenly, it sounded like the cupboard door in the kitchen was flung open and all the pans were thrown around. Piglet, the scaredy cat, immediately puffed up and darted to the bedroom. Gypsy, the other cat, hissed and puffed up, and my husband and I both jumped to our feet and ran into the kitchen. But when we got there, nothing had been disturbed. Another recurring event was the shadow figure. The first time I saw it, I was lying in bed facing the wall. The foot of my bed faced the closet, one of whose doors was slightly open, blocking the view of a small part of the bedroom door. I was reading when I started noticing movement in the corner of my eye, near the ceiling, as if someone was peeking around the corner. Piglet, who was curled up next to me, had also noticed something and was acting strange. When I looked to see what he was staring at, I caught a glimpse of a shadow slipping along the wall behind the closet door. As I continued watching, it peered around the edge of the door. Piglet puffed up and hissed at it. The shadow hissed back, and Piglet bolted under the covers. Then, the shadow giggled and slipped back behind the door. I didn't see it again for several days, but when I did, it was back, teasing Piglet again. This time, it was on the floor, backing him into a corner of the bathroom. I saw it 3 more times before we moved. Each time, it was tormenting Piglet. It only seemed to appear after the person who lived upstairs began playing with the Ouija board. The apartment above us had sat empty for many years, but we could always hear someone pacing the floor every night. You could distinctly hear footsteps moving from the bedroom to the bathroom, then to the front room and back again to the bedroom. One day, a friend and I were sitting out on the hood of her car smoking, when something drew our attention to the sliding glass door of the apartment above mine. We saw a short elderly man standing in the doorway, leaning on a cane and smiling down at us. But when we looked away for a second and looked back, he was gone. I've spoken with many other residents in the building, and they've all had similar experiences to mine and my husband's. Recently, though, things have taken a darker turn. One of the ladies who lives next to me called me one day, saying a young girl had knocked on her door, asking to use the phone. But something about the girl didn't sit right with her, so she said no and immediately called me. By the time I got to the door and opened it, the girl was gone. Other residents have seen dark shadow figures roaming the halls, and something has been running up and down the hall by the office, knocking on the walls and knocking things off the bulletin board. Lights in the rec room and exercise room flicker, and a small girl can be heard singing as she walks alongside the creek that runs by the building. A few weeks ago, we transferred to another apartment. Just hours after we started moving in, things began happening again. We were taking a break from moving to get some lunch, and I decided to change my clothes. I closed the bedroom door for privacy, as there were friends over. Piglet was on the bed, and Gypsy was in the clothes basket next to the bed. As I was pulling on my shirt, I heard a tapping on the door. I called out, "Come in," but no one entered. When I opened the door, everyone was in the front room. I asked if anyone had knocked, but they all said no. I've also seen an elderly woman walking from the bedroom hall into the kitchen. She never seems to notice anything going on around her. My husband and I, along with several of our friends, have also heard faint conversations that are just barely audible, along with music that seems to come from nowhere. That's all I have for now, but I'll try to update this as more things happen. I'm hoping to make it out to Beardsley Castle for one of the ghost tours or even a psychic fair. Now that the weather is cooling down and my husband's health is improving, we also want to explore some of the places he grew up hearing about, like the old graveyard near the apartment, and other locations that are said to be haunted. When I was 23 years old, I thought I had a rational mind, maybe. At that time, I had just had my first child, and it was the greatest experience of my life. My father was so proud of me and absolutely fell in love with my little girl. When my daughter was 6 months old, I was bathing her one evening when the phone rang. Immediately, I had that death call feeling, the kind of dread that hits you out of nowhere, as if something terrible is about to happen. My sister-in-law, who was visiting, handed me the phone and said, "Something's wrong." It was my aunt on the other end, telling me they had rushed my father to the hospital. I didn't think much of it at first, but by the time my husband and I arrived at the hospital, my father had already passed away. How do you explain the feeling when a parent dies? I couldn't, so I just held him in my arms and tried to process it. In the Jewish faith, you sit Shiva for 7 days after a death. So, for the next week, I stayed at my father's apartment, surrounded by people talking about things I just couldn't bring myself to care about. That's how it goes, right? After the 7th night, I went home, tired, hurt, angry, and overwhelmed by every emotion you feel after losing someone. That night, I bathed my daughter, then tried to read a book, but I couldn't focus and eventually fell asleep. When I woke up, I felt an eerie sensation. It's hard to describe, but it was like every nerve in my body was on alert. My heart felt like it was being squeezed, and a deep sense of dread washed over me. Suddenly, I heard my daughter crying, but not the usual "I'm hungry" cry. This was different, more like a "come and get me" cry, full of urgency. I rushed to her room, and when I stepped inside, the air was freezing. You could see her breath in the air. I checked the window, but it was closed tightly. The radiator was warm, so there was no explanation for the chill. The fear became overwhelming. I grabbed my daughter and ran out of the room. She wouldn't stop crying, so I handed her to my husband and went back in to check. The cold was gone, but when I looked for her pacifier, it was missing. I searched everywhere but couldn't find it. Then I heard someone call my name, and it sounded just like my father, loud and clear, and in French. A ghostly visit from my father scared me, but I believe now that he came to say goodbye and perhaps took the pacifier as a way to remember my daughter by. After that night, I bought her a new pacifier, and it never went missing again. The next day, I called my mom and told her about what had happened. I was still shaken, crying from the experience. I had never believed in ghosts before, and certainly not something like that. My mom decided that we should take the baby for a long walk and get some fresh air. It was a sunny day, so we went out. While we were walking, my mom suddenly said, "What do you want?" I was confused and replied, "I don't want anything." She then asked, "Then why did you touch my shoulder?" I was sure I hadn't touched her shoulder, and before I could respond, we both heard my father's voice, calling my mom's name, loud and clear, in that same French tone. It was unmistakable. If my mom didn't believe me before, she sure did now. The visits from my father continued for 30 days. In the Jewish tradition, after 30 days, the deceased is said to be with God. As much as I loved my father, I didn't want any more visits. But I was wrong. I had 3 more children, 3 boys. In the Jewish faith, we circumcise our boys on the 8th day, and every time, especially with my first son, who was named after my father, I felt his presence. My daughter, Abba, meaning father in Hebrew, would even say Abba when she saw him. Little things would go missing each time, and I knew it was my father's way of giving his blessings to my sons. They have grown into wonderful men, and I truly believe my father was watching over them. Even now, when I'm alone in my house, reading or writing a letter, I sometimes feel his presence. My daughter felt his presence during her battle with cancer and chemotherapy, and I believe he watched over her through that difficult time. It's happened often over the years. I smile and keep going about my day. Sometimes I think I see him out of the corner of my eye. It's something my daughter and I will never forget, and I know my mother won't either. She's 86 now, and sometimes she still hears him calling her name. Love doesn't die, even when the one you loved has. This story consists of several paranormal experiences that I had between the years of 1998 and 2004, during my teenage years in a small town in upstate New York. When I was 9 years old, my mother and stepfather bought an empty lot in upstate New York and built a house on it. As I got older, I spent a lot of time exploring the woods around our new home. The area was extremely rural, and while exploring, I found various items that made me wonder about the land's history. I discovered a rusted car frame, an old well, numerous soda cans that seemed to be from the 1970s, and other scattered garbage. To me, this seemed like evidence of people who may have lived on the land before our house was built. It's unclear whether there was an old house that had been torn down or if people had simply gone back there to party in the 70s and 80s. At the time, I was too young to conduct proper research, but I've always felt there was something about the land that wasn't fully explained. As a teenager, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, constantly. Day or night, I would often feel as though something was observing me in the house. After a while, I convinced myself that it was just in my head, but the feeling never really went away. On numerous occasions, whether I was watching TV or using the computer, I'd see a quick flash of a black silhouette darting past me, moving at high speed. It would make me snap my head around to see what it was, only to find nothing there. I'll never forget one particular night when I was lying on my side trying to fall asleep. The feeling of being watched was so intense that I was convinced if I turned around, I would see someone standing there. After moving out of that house upon graduating high school, I never felt the same sensation again, and I stopped seeing the black silhouettes. My first truly unexplainable experience happened when I was about 13 or 14 years old. I woke up at around 3 a.m. to see what I thought was my mother leaning against the doorway to my bedroom. She then said, "Come with me, I want to show you something." In my half-asleep state, I simply replied, "No, I want to go back to bed, show me tomorrow." I didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't until the next morning, when I asked my mom what she needed to show me at 3 a.m., that she looked confused and told me she had never gotten up during the night. She hadn't come to my room at all. Readers, please note that this was the only time this happened. I'm not a vivid dreamer. I don't lucid dream, and I've never suffered from night terrors. Neither does my mom. The second unexplainable experience happened around the same age. In addition to seeing the black figures dart past my eyes daily, I was always terrified of the basement at night. I can't explain why, because I wasn't scared of any other part of the house at night. My sister, who was 6 years younger than me, shared the exact same dream while we lived in that house. On separate nights, we both dreamt we were standing at the top of the basement stairs, and for some reason, we threw a ball down into the pitch-black basement. After the ball landed, an unseen entity threw the ball back at us. The fear was so overwhelming that we both woke up. My sister had the same dream, and it wasn't until years later that we spoke about it. She confirmed that it was exactly the same dream, with no differences between what we saw. My sister, who was not a typical afraid of the dark child, was also terrified of her bedroom. She often saw the same black figures in her room, which continued into her teenage years. To this day, she refuses to talk about the things she saw in that room. The third experience occurred one morning when I was waking up for school. My mother, for reasons I'll never understand, decided to set up our computer in the basement. One morning, as I opened the door to walk down to the basement, I saw a rocking chair in the basement slowly rocking back and forth. It wasn't my imagination. My mother was standing right next to me and saw the same thing. No one was in the basement at the time, and there was no break-in. I swear to this day that what I saw was real, and my mom confirmed it. After all these experiences, I came to believe that something evil resided in the basement of our childhood home. My family went through a lot of struggles while living there, and my mother, in particular, suffered greatly. She experienced severe depression, which led to a painful divorce and the eventual breakdown of our family. During my time in that house, I had many dreams where my mother was either being sucked into the basement by some unseen force or enduring intense pain and suffering. These dreams were so vivid and disturbing that I'm grateful we eventually moved out. I later learned that my mother had a friend who practiced witchcraft. When my mom found out about her friend's involvement in witchcraft, she tried to distance herself, which caused a falling out between them. It's unclear whether this had anything to do with the paranormal experiences we had in the house, but it did happen around the same time. About 3 years ago, I started dating my boyfriend, let's call him L. I moved in with him almost immediately, and things were great at first. But soon, I began to notice some very strange sleeping behaviors. L would often sit up in bed cross-legged, as if he were awake, but in an eerie, trance-like state. One night, he even came after me with a bat. It turned out he had been sleepwalking and was trying to confront a man in a suit and hat. At first, I thought nothing of it, just an extreme night terror or maybe some strange sleepwalking episode. But as time went on, the situation got worse, and I started to question what was really happening. Some nights, I would wake up to find him sitting up in bed, yelling things like, "Shut up," or "Go away," as if he was arguing with someone. One night, I woke up to find L standing in the corner of the room, with his head leaned into the corner but not touching it, just about an inch away from the wall. This was terrifying. I demanded that he tell me more about this figure he was seeing, and we eventually gave him the nickname Frank, after the creepy bunny in Donnie Darko. It turned out Frank wasn't just a dream or a figure in L's sleepwalking episodes. Frank was appearing in our bedroom too. L described Frank as a shadowy figure, a man in a militant suit, resembling the uniform of a Nazi, complete with a hat. He would sit in our computer chair, stand in the corner where I'd seen L, or sometimes even stand over our bed, on my side. I couldn't see Frank, but I always felt this overwhelming, oppressive presence in the room, like I was being watched. When Frank was present, L would speak to him in an unintelligible, made-up language, but L could also communicate with him telepathically. Sometimes, L even spoke German to Frank, which was strange because L didn't know any German except during these encounters. Frank appeared in every dream L had for the last 2 years, either in the background or as a direct part of the dream. The encounters with Frank grew more frequent and intense, and I started to see the toll it was taking on Elle. He became more depressed, unmotivated, and almost physically weak. One night, I heard Elle speaking to Frank in his sleep, having a full conversation. I shook him awake, but he was almost in a trance. When I asked what Frank had said, Elle initially wouldn't tell me. Eventually, he admitted that Frank wanted to be inside him. This deeply alarmed me, because I had suspected for some time that Frank might be a dark entity of some sort. I told Elle that he absolutely could not let Frank inside him, but Elle didn't want to listen. He seemed to believe that Frank would make him stronger. This worried me even more. I called my church to ask about having the house blessed, and they said they would get back to me. But after that, I never heard from them again. One night, I woke up to hear Elle giving permission for Frank to enter him. I tried to wake him up, but by then, I suspect the damage had already been done. After that, Elle stopped having night disturbances, but his behavior became even more troubling. He started setting fires in the woods a mile from our house and in an abandoned house next door. He began using drugs and acting aggressively, even when he wasn't using. One night, in the middle of the night, Elle sat up in bed again, and something about it made me feel an overwhelming sense of fear. My fight or flight instinct kicked in, and I called his name several times, but he didn't respond. Then I said, "Frank?" And suddenly, Elle turned his head slowly towards me with a terrifying smile creeping across his face. I screamed, and it seemed to snap him out of whatever trance he was in. After much pleading, I convinced him to try and get rid of Frank. It was strange. Elle was arguing with Frank, but it seemed like he was speaking to Frank through another entity that Elle called Steve. Frank allegedly warned that I was next. However, after that night, Frank never appeared again in our room, or in Elle's dreams. I know some people might think Elle was messing with me, or that he was suffering from some mental health issues. But I can tell you, this wasn't some elaborate prank. I felt something very strongly in the room during these interactions, something that made my skin crawl. Elle's eyes also looked different during these episodes. He wasn't the same person. I still wonder if Frank was a demon, a shadow person, or some kind of dark entity. I'm convinced that it was something supernatural, and to this day, I still feel unsettled by the experience. Whatever it was, I'll never forget the terror it caused. I'm 26 years old now, but some of the most intense paranormal experiences in my life happened between the ages of 10 and 15, when I lived in a house in a small town in upstate New York. It's a house I've been in for most of my life, and the strange occurrences have been a constant part of my experiences growing up. When I was younger, I would tell my parents about strange things, like the ghost tickling me, but they always brushed it off. When I was 10, my mother and stepfather bought a house in a quiet neighborhood. The house itself was built in the 1950s, and while it wasn't very old, it was surrounded by a lot of history and had a certain energy to it. I spent a lot of time exploring the house and the surrounding area, and that's when I first started noticing the oddities. At first, nothing about the house was overtly threatening, but it did always feel off. I would get these strange feelings of being watched, sometimes during the day and other times at night. And it wasn't just me. My cats and dog would often react as if something was there too, sometimes staring at the air or running off in a hurry. When I was 15, things took a turn for the stranger. My younger sister, who doesn't believe in ghosts, came upstairs to my room one night, asking if I was playing a prank on her. She said she saw someone, about my height, walk across the room on the opposite side of the house and disappear into the piano. She didn't get a clear look, but she thought it was me, as the figure appeared to be dressed in dark clothing. I assured her it wasn't me, and I had been upstairs the entire time. We locked ourselves in my room, afraid there might be an intruder in the house. We called my dad, but when he arrived, there was no sign of anyone having been in the house. Months later, I had another unsettling experience. I was in the living room with my sister and a couple of friends, getting ready for a surprise party, when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I looked directly at the room and saw a figure, someone wearing a baggy white dress, walking across the house. At first, I thought someone had broken in, so we all ran out and asked my neighbor, a detective, to check the house. He found nothing, and everything was secure. My sister and I agreed that what I saw was probably the same figure she had seen dart across the room months earlier. I saw the figure again a few months later, while I was studying for a French test. I locked eyes with it for a brief moment as it crossed the same room, and after that, I never saw it again. That was the last time I encountered that figure, but more strange things would happen. 2 months ago, a friend of mine stayed over at our house. I hadn't told him about any of the strange experiences I'd had, but the day after he spent the night, he told me that he saw the same figure I had seen before. He was in the room where I'd seen it, and he watched a woman in a white dress walk briskly across the room, looking away from him, in the direction I had previously locked eyes with the figure. He didn't tell me right away because he didn't feel unsafe, but was so surprised by what he saw that he didn't know how to react. After he left, I had another encounter with something I couldn't explain. A friend came over and decided to do a tarot card reading for me. After the reading, we were sitting in the living room when we started hearing what sounded like shuffling across the house. My cat immediately ran away and hid behind the couch, hissing in fear. My friend and I brushed it off, thinking it was nothing. But a few minutes later, the shuffling noise happened again, and then we heard a drawer being slammed repeatedly in the kitchen. My cat ran upstairs and into my room, clearly spooked. We went downstairs to check, but found nothing. The doors had all been locked, and there was no legitimate explanation for what had happened. The very next night, something even more unsettling happened. It was my last night at home before returning to college. Around 8 p.m., I heard the shuffling sound again, followed by my dog barking and growling. I went downstairs, and as soon as I entered the room, everything stopped. The dog stopped barking, and the shuffling stopped. My dog walked up to me, whined, and sat beside me, looking nervous. Later that night, I was in the living room, watching Friends and painting, just relaxing before I left. As I was sitting on the couch, I felt something tap me 3 times on the shoulder. At the same time, the TV turned off on its own, and a pen dropped across the room. My cat, who had been sitting on the couch with me, leaped off and ran upstairs. No one was behind me. Of all the experiences I've had in this house, this one was the most chilling. Something had physically touched me to get my attention. This was the first time anything like that had happened to me, and it left me feeling deeply unsettled. But the weirdest part? My cat had been there the whole time, reacting to things I couldn't see. As for whether or not I should feel threatened by these experiences, I'm not sure. It feels like the presence wants to communicate with me, or at least make itself known. I've had paranormal experiences in the past, including seeing my friend's deceased grandfather when I didn't know what he looked like. I wonder if the presence in my house is trying to communicate, and if I should try talking to it next time it makes itself known. Or should I ask it to leave? What's even more troubling is that the events seem to happen around the same areas of the house, especially near my son's room, which has me wondering if there's a connection between the presence and him. I'm still trying to understand what it all means and whether there's a deeper significance to it. Over the past couple of weeks, I started to feel the presence of a spirit in our home, which I quickly identified as my father-in-law. One day, my mother-in-law came over in a panic because she had received a renewed credit card, and the letter that came with it explained that it had a chip. She was confused about what it meant, so I tried to explain that the chip is for the tap function at places with card readers. As usual, she needed reassurance and called my husband, who confirmed the same thing. As she was about to leave, she went to put the card in her pocket but couldn't feel it. So, the search began. I told everyone to sit down and relax for a minute, then I said, "Dad, put it back." My husband went to get something to drink and found the card on the kitchen floor, in the exact spot they had already checked. My husband shrugged it off, saying things like that happen all the time around here. At that point, I really felt my father-in-law had stuck around. Later, I was on my tablet when it started acting up, switching pages or opening the menu on its own. It was frustrating, and I could feel my father-in-law's presence, as if he were annoyed with me. He seemed to be messing with me in return, just to get a reaction. Not long after, I started sensing another presence, one that felt very different. This one felt annoyed as well, but in a more frustrated way. I quickly realized it was my grandfather, who had been a huge dog lover. Around this time, my youngest dog, Jethro, had been diagnosed with a cancerous tumor on his liver and a smaller one on the neck of his spleen. His stomach had started to bloat about a month ago, which I knew was a sign that things were getting worse. Jethro was still active, running out to bark at the neighbor's dog and playing with him along the fence. But once inside, he would immediately get a drink and then flop down on his bed, clearly exhausted. My husband was in denial, saying Jethro still looked fine and was eating well. But I could feel both my father-in-law and my grandfather growing more and more frustrated with me, especially as I kept bringing up how sick Jethro was. I finally told them both. Be annoyed with my husband, because it seemed like he was ignoring the signs. Saturday morning was the turning point. My husband noticed how badly Jethro's stomach had bloated and how he growled when he touched it. We realized it was time, so we discussed putting him down. I made the appointment for that day. We woke up our daughter and youngest son to say goodbye to Jethro, but my oldest son had already gotten up to get ready for work. I crouched down to pet our oldest dog, and he just pressed his head into my chest, rubbing up and down as if he knew what was happening. The other dogs were restless, sensing that Jethro wouldn't be coming back, even though he was only 6.5 years old. I didn't want my husband to come into the room with me because he had been through this once before with a previous pet, and it had been too much for him. When I got to the vet, they took Jethro to the back to place a catheter in his leg. They called me into the exam room, and when I went in, I could feel that Jethro was agitated, thinking they were going to poke him more. The vet and 2 technicians came in, and they administered the drugs to put him to sleep. I held his head in my hands, kissed him, and told him I loved him as he peacefully passed away. The whole time I was in the room, it felt overcrowded, even before the vet and technicians came in. I could sense my grandfather and father-in-law were there with me. After the vet checked for a heartbeat, she left me in the room to say my final goodbyes. I sat there and cried for about 20 minutes. When the vet returned with a blanket for my knees, the room felt empty. My father-in-law had left, and after Jethro passed, my grandfather left too. As I prepared to leave, I told the vet that my husband was waiting in the lobby. She sat next to Jethro and gently stroked his fur, telling him what a good dog he was. I could hear her voice break as she spoke. I thanked her for helping me make the right decision and for being so compassionate. She gave me a hug and said she wished she didn't have to do this, but that it was the right thing because Jethro had been so sick. When we got home, our oldest dog let out a loud cry. He laid down later, and when I went to pet him, he didn't raise his head or wag his tail. It was clear he was depressed, and the other 2 dogs were similarly down. I work at a small-town hospital in northern New York State, and for obvious reasons, I'm keeping the name and exact location of the hospital anonymous. However, after hearing countless stories and having numerous paranormal experiences myself, I felt it was too important not to share. This hospital was built in the late 1800s, and I was curious about its history, so I did some digging. I found that the land had a long and varied past. It was once home to woods, farmland, and houses. Over the centuries, many important battles were fought here, including ones during the French and Indian War, the American Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Civil War. The area was also a major trade route for early American settlers, with lots of death and conflict, which certainly makes for a lot of potential spirits. Then, in the late 1800s, the hospital was built on this land, and the history of sickness and death continued. Later on, a nursing home was added to the facility, compounding the history of death that could very well have led to the many ghostly encounters that I, and many others, have experienced. One of the most haunted areas of the hospital, by far, is the second floor. This floor houses the pediatrics unit, the sleep center, medical records, and several other offices. It was once home to a smaller medical/surgical unit, but that has since been closed off and turned into more office space. It's an area with a lot of activity, and not all of it is friendly. Whenever it's brought up among employees, everyone agrees, the second floor gives them an unsettling feeling, even during the daytime. Many people report feeling an invisible force, as if something is trying to push them out of the space. Some nurses have even described going up the stairwell to the second floor, and as soon as they reach for the doorknob, the door opens on its own. There's also the strange occurrence with the elevator. Often, it will stop at the second floor, the doors open, but no one is there. This happens even when the second floor button hasn't been pushed. But these are just the tip of the iceberg for the second floor. As I work the night shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., I've spent a lot of time there, especially during what's commonly called the witching hour. Believe me, it's no fun. The moonlit nights seem to make things worse, and when I'm carrying around electronic devices like my cell phone, the activity seems to spike. The hallways are particularly creepy at night. One of the strangest things I've noticed is a ghostly figure that seems to run a continuous loop around the floor. If you're walking past the sleep lab toward the elevators, no matter the time of day, you'll feel like someone is following you. It's not threatening, but it's definitely unsettling. If you walk past the elevators and head toward the stairwell instead, it suddenly feels as though something is pushing you out the door. It's a foreboding, almost aggressive feeling. Now, the pediatrics unit has its own set of strange happenings. I've been there many times alone and have heard the sound of doors closing by themselves, even though I know they weren't open when I last checked. There are constant bumps and bangs, especially at the back of the unit, like a polar effect. One time, 2 nurses went down there and heard what sounded like children laughing and playing, so loud that they actually fled the floor in fear. Another nurse reported seeing the silhouette of a little girl in the back playroom. The girl appeared and then vanished, and to this day, that nurse refuses to go near the room alone. At the opposite end of the second floor is the sleep lab and the medical records department. I've never ventured into the sleep lab at night, but I've been to medical records many times. That place is crawling with spirits, and a few employees who are psychically attuned have confirmed what I've felt. My wife, who is a healer and psychic, always felt that something bad was in there. She said she could feel a dark presence, something waiting for her whenever she arrived. One of my colleagues, another psychic, came with her to confirm the haunting, and she flat out refused to enter the room. As for me, I've been in medical records many times, mostly on business, but there's something about that room that always unsettles me. Every time I step inside, I get a splitting headache, but the pain always vanishes once I leave. My wife says there are spirits trapped in that room, and she believes a demon is the one holding them there. This thing is always in the back of the department, by a cubicle, and it's visible as soon as you open the door. While I've never seen the demon myself, I've heard enough to make me believe it's there. Several people, myself included, have heard whispering voices. 2 men, I think, coming from the back corner, near where the demon supposedly resides. Whenever you get close, the whispering stops, like they realize you're listening. There's nobody else in the department at that hour, so the voices are unexplainable. My wife once took a dowsing crystal down there, and she confirmed the presence of a demon, which didn't take kindly to her being there and urged her to leave. I've had my own experiences. One night, I clearly heard the voice of an old woman call out, "Hello?" right behind me. When I spun around, no one was there. And then there's the lights. On several occasions, I've walked into the department only to find lights on that were off when I left. When I've returned later, different lights would be on. One night, I was walking toward the light switches to leave, and when I flicked the switch to turn off the lights, the light behind me turned back on, without the switch being moved. That's a glimpse of what's happening on the second floor, but the activity doesn't stop there. There's more to come, and I'll be sharing more stories in the future, especially about the haunting of the hospital and the strange entities that still linger. I work at a small-town hospital in northern New York State, and while I'm omitting the name of the hospital and its exact location, I can tell you that the experiences I've had there, along with many stories from my coworkers, are far from ordinary. For us hospital workers, these occurrences have become part of the daily routine, though we don't often talk about them outside of work. But I felt it was a shame not to share them, especially after hearing so many wild stories and having a few of my own. The hospital was built in the late 1800s, and after doing some research, I found out the land had seen many different uses over the years. There were woods, farmland, and homes before the hospital came into being, and throughout its history, the area has been home to many conflicts, battles from the French and Indian War, the American Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Civil War. There were also early skirmishes between Native Americans and European settlers. The land was located along a major trade route for early colonial Americans, so it's no surprise that this place has witnessed its fair share of death, strife, and history. Then, in the late 1800s, the hospital was built, and as expected, it became a place for more sickness and death. Over time, a nursing home was added to the facility, contributing even more to the accumulation of spirits that seem to have stuck around. In the first installment of this story, I shared some history about the hospital and its grounds, and I focused on the second floor, which houses several departments like pediatrics, the sleep center, and medical records. As mentioned, the second floor is one of the most haunted areas of the hospital, especially at night, which is when I work. Like many places, the second floor feels eerie in the dark, but there's something different about it, something that makes the atmosphere feel thick and unsettling, like it's not just the usual darkness. When you work in a place like this, you learn to sense the energies around you and tread carefully, but there's always a part of you that wants to investigate. Sometimes, curiosity can get the better of you, and it did for me. As I mentioned before, the second floor is notorious for its paranormal activity, but one area in particular, the medical records department, has always been the most haunted. My wife, a psychic, healer, and metaphysical researcher, did a crystal dowsing experiment in that area one night. She had long suspected there was something demonic lurking there, and her crystal work confirmed it. There was indeed a demon in that department. But before that happened, she shared a story with me. One night, as she approached the door to the medical records department, she noticed something strange. Outside the door, there's a collection of old black and white photos of past doctors who worked at the hospital. One of these photos, front and center, was particularly striking. It always drew her eye, and one night she noticed something disturbing about it. The doctor in the photo had crimson eyes. The rest of the room was dark, and there was no light source that could explain the red eyes, making it clear that something wasn't right. My wife, who is skilled in sensing paranormal entities, had learned that this demon would usually try to intimidate her when she arrived, but that night, it seemed to be waiting for her. Since then, she's avoided that photo, unable to shake the sense of warning it gave her. I didn't take these warnings seriously at first. I've always had a strong sense of will and confidence, which I thought would protect me from anything paranormal. However, I was unaware of the practice of grounding in the metaphysical world, which helps protect your energy from malicious forces. One night, I decided to poke around parts of the medical records department that I didn't usually visit, just to see what I could find. After leaving that area, I immediately felt different, like something had followed me. The ghost that normally haunts the hall, a figure who moves between the sleep center and the elevators, felt different too. It was as though it was urging me to leave, a feeling of fear and protectiveness that I'd never sensed from it before. Later that night, I had a disturbing dream. At first, I thought it was just a bad dream, but it lingered with me for days. In the dream, a face appeared in the corner of the room, sharp teeth, fierce eyes, and an evil smile. The image haunted me, making me restless and drained. I couldn't shake it. I told my wife about the dream, and she took me to see a clairvoyant, a psychic with more experience in these matters. She did a reading on me and confirmed that I had picked up an attachment, an entity that had latched onto my energy. The psychic gave us some instructions on how to cleanse myself and our home. After following her advice, I felt an immediate sense of relief. It was like I had been sick and just gotten better. The oppressive energy was gone, and I felt lighter and free from the entity's grip. After that, I learned my lesson: always ground yourself and use caution when dealing with the unknown. But even with that, my experiences on the first floor of the hospital continued. The first floor houses a wide variety of departments, from the lobby and switchboard operator to the emergency room, operating room, intensive care unit, and others. While I don't work in all of these areas, I do have a few stories worth sharing, mostly from the ER, where my wife works the overnight shift. One of my colleagues, a nurse who is also sensitive to the paranormal, shared a story about seeing 3 men walking down the hallway near the nursing administration office late at night. The men appeared full-bodied, but they were transparent, dressed in early 20th century clothing. She stood aside to let them pass, but when they turned the corner, they vanished. This nurse was used to seeing apparitions, but this was the most vivid one she'd witnessed on the first floor. Another nurse had a similar experience in the lobby, where she was talking to the nursing supervisor. Out of nowhere, an elderly woman appeared, walking up the stairwell and passing right between them without saying a word or even acknowledging their presence. The nurse thought the woman was rude and said, "Excuse me," but the woman never responded. When she turned to the supervisor to comment, the supervisor looked confused and asked, "What do you mean, excuse me?" The nurse realized the supervisor hadn't seen the woman at all, which left her completely baffled. In the emergency room, my wife and I have encountered some strange occurrences as well. She's had experiences where a ghostly presence would slap her on the shoulder, making her jump, only to find no one there. Another time, something slammed down on her desk so loudly that it shook her up, but no one else heard it. The most disturbing encounter, however, was when my wife saw the apparition of an old woman. It wasn't a full-bodied figure but just her head and upper torso, floating in midair. The woman passed right in front of my wife's desk before disappearing into the wall. These are just a few of the countless stories from the hospital. The place is crawling with spirits, and while some of them are harmless, others are downright unsettling. If you're thinking about investigating a haunted place, take my advice. Always be cautious, know how to protect yourself, and don't let curiosity lead you into something you're not prepared for. I work at a small-town hospital in northern New York State, and while I'm omitting the name of the hospital and its exact location, I can tell you that the experiences I've had there, along with many stories from my coworkers, are far from ordinary. For us hospital workers, these occurrences have become part of the daily routine, though we don't often talk about them outside of work. But I felt it was a shame not to share them, especially after hearing so many wild stories and having a few of my own. The hospital was built in the late 1800s, and after doing some research, I found out the land had seen many different uses over the years. There were woods, farmland, and homes before the hospital came into being, and throughout its history, the area has been home to many conflicts, battles from the French and Indian War, the American Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Civil War. There were also early skirmishes between Native Americans and European settlers. The land was located along a major trade route for early colonial Americans, so it's no surprise that this place has witnessed its fair share of death, strife, and history. Then, in the late 1800s, the hospital was built, and as expected, it became a place for more sickness and death. Over time, a nursing home was added to the facility, contributing even more to the accumulation of spirits that seem to have stuck around. In the first part of this story, I shared some history about the hospital and its grounds, and I focused on the second floor, which houses the pediatrics unit, sleep center, and medical records. As mentioned, the second floor is one of the most haunted areas of the hospital, especially at night, which is when I work. Like many places, the second floor feels eerie in the dark, but there's something different about it, something that makes the atmosphere feel thick and unsettling, like it's not just the usual darkness. When you work in a place like this, you learn to sense the energies around you and tread carefully, but there's always a part of you that wants to investigate. Sometimes, curiosity can get the better of you, and it did for me. As I mentioned before, the second floor is notorious for its paranormal activity, but one area in particular, the medical records department, has always been the most haunted. My wife, a psychic, healer, and metaphysical researcher, did a crystal dowsing experiment in that area one night. She had long suspected there was something demonic lurking there, and her crystal work confirmed it. There was indeed a demon in that department. But before that happened, she shared a story with me. One night, as she approached the door to the medical records department, she noticed something strange. Outside the door, there's a collection of old black and white photos of past doctors who worked at the hospital. One of these photos, front and center, was particularly striking. It always drew her eye, and one night she noticed something disturbing about it. The doctor in the photo had crimson eyes. The rest of the room was dark, and there was no light source that could explain the red eyes, making it clear that something wasn't right. My wife, who is skilled in sensing paranormal entities, had learned that this demon would usually try to intimidate her when she arrived, but that night, it seemed to be waiting for her. Since then, she's avoided that photo, unable to shake the sense of warning it gave her. I didn't take these warnings seriously at first. I've always had a strong sense of will and confidence, which I thought would protect me from anything paranormal. However, I was unaware of the practice of grounding in the metaphysical world, which helps protect your energy from malicious forces. One night, I decided to poke around parts of the medical records department that I didn't usually visit, just to see what I could find. After leaving that area, I immediately felt different, like something had followed me. The ghost that normally haunts the hall, a figure who moves between the sleep center and the elevators, felt different too. It was as though it was urging me to leave, a feeling of fear and protectiveness that I'd never sensed from it before. Later that night, I had a disturbing dream. At first, I thought it was just a bad dream, but it lingered with me for days. In the dream, a face appeared in the corner of the room, sharp teeth, fierce eyes, and an evil smile. The image haunted me, making me restless and drained. I couldn't shake it. I told my wife about the dream, and she took me to see a clairvoyant, a psychic with more experience in these matters. She did a reading on me and confirmed that I had picked up an attachment, an entity that had latched onto my energy. The psychic gave us some instructions on how to cleanse myself and our home. After following her advice, I felt an immediate sense of relief. It was like I had been sick and just gotten better. The oppressive energy was gone, and I felt lighter and free from the entity's grip. After that, I learned my lesson: always ground yourself and use caution when dealing with the unknown. But even with that, my experiences on the first floor of the hospital continued. The first floor houses a wide variety of departments, from the lobby and switchboard operator to the emergency room, operating room, intensive care unit, and others. While I don't work in all of these areas, I do have a few stories worth sharing, mostly from the ER, where my wife works the overnight shift. One of my colleagues, a nurse who is also sensitive to the paranormal, shared a story about seeing 3 men walking down the hallway near the nursing administration office late at night. The men appeared full-bodied, but they were transparent, dressed in early 20th century clothing. She stood aside to let them pass, but when they turned the corner, they vanished. This nurse was used to seeing apparitions, but this was the most vivid one she'd witnessed on the first floor. Another nurse had a similar experience in the lobby, where she was talking to the nursing supervisor. Out of nowhere, an elderly woman appeared, walking up the stairwell and passing right between them without saying a word or even acknowledging their presence. The nurse thought the woman was rude and said, "Excuse me," but the woman never responded. When she turned to the supervisor to comment, the supervisor looked confused and asked, "What do you mean, excuse me?" The nurse realized the supervisor hadn't seen the woman at all, which left her completely baffled. In the emergency room, my wife and I have encountered some strange occurrences as well. She's had experiences where a ghostly presence would slap her on the shoulder, making her jump, only to find no one there. Another time, something slammed down on her desk so loudly that it shook her up, but no one else heard it. The most disturbing encounter, however, was when my wife saw the apparition of an old woman. It wasn't a full-bodied figure but just her head and upper torso, floating in midair. The woman passed right in front of my wife's desk before disappearing into the wall. These are just a few of the countless stories from the hospital. The place is crawling with spirits, and while some of them are harmless, others are downright unsettling. If you're thinking about investigating a haunted place, take my advice. Always be cautious, know how to protect yourself, and don't let curiosity lead you into something you're not prepared for. My name is Maria, and you may recognize my husband's name from his posts here. He's shared stories about the hospital where we both work, and I thought I'd add a few of my own experiences to the mix. My husband and I work at the same hospital in a small town, and while I can't disclose the name of the hospital for privacy reasons, I can assure you it's a place filled with a mix of benevolent, neutral, and downright frightening entities. I've always been sensitive to the paranormal. I'm a psychic, healer, and clairsentient, so it's no surprise that I've experienced quite a few strange occurrences, especially at work. My first real experience at the hospital happened in 2010, when I started working there. It was a warm August morning, and I was taken to a room that, at the time, I had no idea was haunted. The first thing I noticed was the air in the room. Despite it being bright and sunny outside, there was a dense, suffocating haze in the room. It felt almost as though something was pressing down on me. I was learning how to use the computer to enter patient information, and as I stood by the doorway while my instructor showed me the ropes, I could hardly breathe. It felt as if there was an invisible hand covering my mouth, and a deep, oppressive weight hung in the room. I pushed through it, but I felt like I was suffocating. When my instructor finally said, "Let's go learn patient rounds," and we left the room, the pressure lifted instantly. But as I walked down the hall, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. On the same wing of the hospital, there was another room at the end of the hall where I began to notice a dark presence. Even with the hall light shining through the door, I would feel something watching me from within the room. It wasn't a threatening feeling, but it was definitely unnerving. This was around the time I started working my night shift, and it didn't take long for me to realize the intensity of the energy on that floor. I'll shift focus for a moment to my grandmother's house, where I was raised. It's an old house in the Adirondacks, surrounded by rich Native American history, and I didn't always know I was sensitive to spirits. Growing up there, I noticed strange things, but I kept quiet because talking about such things was considered taboo in my family. My brother, however, was also aware of the strange presence in the house, particularly in the basement. My grandmother's house was very old, and I learned later that it was built on top of a Native American burial site. My grandmother wasn't involved in the disturbing of the land, but as we all know, graves should never be disturbed. After my grandfather passed, I began to notice a dark presence in the basement, particularly around an old potato crib where my grandparents used to store potatoes. My brother and I were always made to go down there to fetch some, but we'd feel an overpowering, uncomfortable energy in that part of the basement. It always drove us out quickly. As I got older, the entity seemed to focus on me more than anyone else. It followed me around the house, and I often felt it lurking in the hallway, especially when I was alone. I would race to turn on the kitchen light, just to feel more at ease. It would always make its presence known when I was at the top of the stairs, and I would feel a chill run down my spine. I later learned to respect it, whatever it was, and didn't challenge its presence anymore. On one particular occasion, my husband and I were at my grandmother's house, and we were standing in the living room facing each other. I was much more aware of my psychic abilities by this point, and as we stood there, I felt the entity surge up through the floor and touch my feet. It didn't threaten me, but I could feel its presence, strong and clear. Since then, I've come to understand that this entity, while unsettling, actually protects the house and its inhabitants. It just liked to mess with me. After my grandfather passed, we had a guest stay at the house who brought along a guitar. It was pleasant to hear him play, but one night, he played well past 1 a.m. As an insomniac, I was already having trouble sleeping, and when I got out of bed, I noticed something odd. The dining room light was on, but the living room light was off. I went downstairs, thinking the guest was still playing, but as I walked toward the living room, I realized the music had stopped. When I looked at the guitar, I saw it was sitting untouched on its stand. The guest was fast asleep, and there was no one playing it. I hurried back upstairs, too shaken to speak of it again until I told my husband years later. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Starting in my early 20s, I began experiencing something unusual. Once in a while, a deceased family member would come to me in a dream. They would insist that I accompany them to a train station, cruise ship, or airport, and stay with them until they left. Within a week or so of these dreams, the person would pass away. One night, I had what felt more like an out-of-body experience than a regular dream. My grandfather was in the hospital, and he made me promise that I would take care of my grandmother after he was gone. In the dream, I was in his room, and he grabbed my hands, asking if I remembered my promise. I assured him I had, then I suddenly jolted awake. I made a mental note to call my grandmother later that day, but when I called the hospital, she was upset with me and told me it wasn't a good time before hanging up. I knew in that moment that it was the day he would die. A few hours later, I received the call confirming that he had passed. Another time, I had a dream about a very old, crotchety woman who spoke with an odd accent. She was very abrupt, and I asked her who she was. She looked at me and said, "Don't you recognize your own grandmother?" I hadn't seen my paternal grandparents since I was about 3 years old. My grandmother had made my grandfather move back to Switzerland, which he didn't want to do. The reason her accent sounded strange was because she grew up in the German-speaking part of Switzerland, while my grandfather came from the French-speaking part, Bern, to be exact. My father was the first in his family to be born in the U.S. My grandmother passed away a few days later. Then there was the time my Uncle George, my maternal grandfather's brother, came to me in a dream. He didn't speak to me, but I knew it was him, despite the fact that he had suffered at least 2 strokes by that point. The next day, I called my mother and told her to reach out to Aunt Ruth and check on Uncle George. My mother was annoyed and brushed it off, telling me that he was fine. A week later, my mother called me to let me know that Uncle George had passed away from a massive stroke the night before. Some relatives didn't visit me in dreams, though. Neither of my parents did, but I was holding my mother's hand when she passed away. My maternal grandmother also didn't come to me, but she had been suffering from a massive stroke for some time before her death. Now on to my Uncle Frank, my mother's brother. One night, I had a very vivid dream about being at a Rangers hockey game just before Thanksgiving. I've always liked hockey, but I'd never been to a Rangers game, only an Islanders game once. In the dream, I was confused but still enjoying the game. I went to get a soda or something, and when I looked around, I saw my Uncle Frank standing about 15 feet away from me, smiling, with orbs floating around him. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it felt comforting. The Saturday after Thanksgiving, I got a call from my sister asking if I knew that Uncle Frank had passed away. I called my aunt later to offer my condolences and ask about the wake. She told me they were only having him laid out on Sunday, with the service on Monday. My husband, daughter, and I went to the wake on Sunday, and when I saw my Uncle Frank, I was struck by the fact that he wasn't wearing the traditional suit. Instead, he was dressed in a Rangers jacket, the same team from my dream. It felt surreal, like the dream had been a premonition, and the coincidence hit me hard. In 1990, our school arranged a field trip for the first and second graders. It was called Babyland, and, as one of the teachers described it, it was going to be in Educational experience. When I first heard about the trip, I was beyond excited. My mother was pregnant at the time, and I thought Babyland would teach me all sorts of things about babies, so I could be the best older sibling to my soon-to-arrive brother or sister. It's important to mention that English isn't my first language, and neither of my parents spoke or read it fluently. As a first grader, I did my best to translate the field trip details for them. I emphasized the name of the place, Babyland, but when it came to the other words in the description, I had no idea what they meant, so I left them out. My parents agreed to let me go, and I was overjoyed. On the day of the trip, I packed all the necessary items that the school had requested: crayons, colored pencils, several sheets of blank art paper, and a sheet to sit on. I remember imagining the picnic we'd have and the babies that would be there, waiting for me to show off my artistic skills. I was bursting with excitement, eagerly anticipating the day. When we got to school, I was surprised to see that many students hadn't shown up for the trip or hadn't received permission to go. Out of 60 first and second graders, only about 40 of us were going. I felt bad for the ones who missed out and decided I'd make up for it by drawing the cutest babies I could imagine and sharing them with the others. I was determined to make the most of this experience. When we finally arrived at Babyland, it was nothing like I had imagined. I expected to see balloons, playful babies, maybe some clowns, and definitely a lot of people. Instead, all I saw were fields of grass, some sprinklers running, and rows of stone blocks neatly organized across the area. I thought it was strange but dismissed it as part of the Babyland theme. I looked around for the babies, for the laughter, for the people, but none of them were there. Where were the babies? Where were the mommies and daddies? The bus stopped, and we got out. I expected to see a clown or some cheerful person greet us, but instead, we were met by two adults in dark suits. They spoke to us in a language I didn't understand, though I later realized it was likely English, and I just wasn't paying attention. I continued to look around, still hoping for a sight of babies or something playful, but all I saw were more stone blocks, statues, and a lot of green grass. It didn't feel fun at all. Our first task was to trace the designs on the stone blocks with our art paper. The teachers demonstrated how to do it, and we followed. I became quickly bored. The stones were old and ugly, and I didn't want to draw them. I had come here expecting something different. I wanted to draw babies, not stones. The other kids were running around, so I decided to lay out my picnic sheet and sit down, hoping to find something interesting to sketch. As I sat there, I saw a little boy running from stone to stone, sketching them as he went. He looked like he was having fun, so I ran over to him and asked what he was doing. He ignored me, but I started sketching the stones he had drawn. He kept running to the next one before I could finish. I tried to catch up with him, but he disappeared behind a tall statue. I searched for him for several minutes, but he was nowhere to be found. Eventually, I gave up and decided to sketch the inscription on the statue instead. As I finished my drawing, I felt someone looking at me. I turned around, but no one was nearby. I could still see the other students and teachers far down the hall, but they were out of earshot. Then I heard, "Hey, up here!" I looked up and saw the little boy, sitting on top of the statue. "Wow, how did you get up there?" I asked, but he didn't answer. Instead, he called out to me, "Over here, behind you." When I turned around, he was standing right behind me. I jumped back, startled. "How did you do that?" I asked, but he just giggled and ran off. "What's your name?" I called out after him. "Robert, but you can call me Robbie," he shouted back, disappearing behind a stone head. I felt strange after that encounter, a little shaken and confused. Something about Robert didn't feel right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew something was off. Just then, one of the teachers spotted me and told me to return to the group. As I walked back, it suddenly hit me: Robert had spoken to me without moving his mouth. His skin was unusually pale, much paler than anyone I'd ever met, and his clothes seemed strange, almost like he was wearing a one-piece dress. The whole encounter was unnerving, and I was glad to be moving away from that part of the grounds. When I joined the rest of the group, the teacher asked why I had wandered off so far. I told her I had been looking for fun places and babies. She looked at me curiously and asked if my parents had told me anything about the trip. I told her I had translated Babyland to my parents, but she seemed concerned and told me that I misunderstood. It turns out Babyland wasn't a fun, baby-filled playground. It was a cemetery for infants and children. The full name was Babyland at Pinelon Memorial Park, and our task was to do stone rubbings of the graves. I realized with horror that I had been walking on top of graves, and I had unknowingly sketched the headstone of a deceased child. When I looked at my drawing, it clearly read, Robert E. Smith, our beloved son, you're in God's arms now. 1950 to 1956. In mid-February, I received a call from my mother-in-law a little after 9 a.m. She told me that the doctor had called and said she needed to get to the hospital immediately for a blood transfusion. I had only gotten about 2.5 hours of sleep the night before due to pain, and I had just woken up, feeling exhausted and barely functional. I quickly gulped down a cup of coffee, rushed to my room to get dressed, and heard my father-in-law's voice in my head telling me to slow down, that she'd be fine. If I could charge rent to the spirits that visit us, my mortgage would be paid off. My father-in-law seems to be around all the time. I woke up my kids to let them know what was happening, and then called my husband to tell him he might want to come home. After that, I drove my mother-in-law to the ER. When we arrived, the nurse asked her why she was there. My mother-in-law explained she was there for a blood transfusion, but the nurse responded somewhat dismissively, saying that they would decide if she needed one. I understand nurses have tough jobs, but there was no reason for her to be so snotty about it. After we were called into the exam area, they started asking my mother-in-law about what she had told them in the waiting room. I told her I was going to step outside for a cigarette. As I walked past the nursing station, I felt like I had walked through something thick, like a heavy energy, and I mumbled to myself, "Great. I just walked through a spirit I didn't see or sense because I'm so tired." When I finished my cigarette, I saw my husband walking toward the entrance of the ER, so we went in together. When we reached my mother-in-law's stretcher, she told us to go home and come back later. They ended up keeping her in the hospital from Thursday until Tuesday, but they never figured out what was wrong with her. Around the same time, our dog Dee was getting worse. At 13.5 years old, he had developed fatty tumors, one of which was growing under his front leg. He had arthritis and was having increasing difficulty walking. I knew in my heart that his time was near, but I waited until after my youngest son's birthday to tell my husband. He told me to give it a few more days. I thought, here we go again, just like with our other dog, Jethro, who we had to wait to make a decision about. But I told my husband by the end of the week because Dee could barely walk anymore. By then, he wouldn't go outside without being led on a leash. My son Eric has Mondays and Thursdays off. One night, when it was particularly cold, my husband started a fire in the wood stove. After he went to bed, my son and I were sitting in the living room when suddenly, we heard a noise. The arm of the top damper on the stove dropped down with a loud sound, as if someone had opened it in a hurry. My son and I jumped in surprise. I looked at him and said, "That was my grandfather, he's mad." I told my youngest son that Thursday would be the day we needed to take Dee to the vet, as he was barely getting up by then. He asked if he could be in the room with Dee when it was time. I asked him if he was sure, and he said yes. Thursday came, and I made the appointment. When we brought Dee to the vet, they took him into another room to put a catheter in his leg. Afterward, they called us in to be with him. He laid down in front of us, and I cradled his head in my lap. The vet gave him the injection, and I stroked his head, telling him what a great dog he was, and kissed him. After he passed, my son and I stayed with him for a while, crying and petting him. At one point, I felt a warmth on my back, as though someone was comforting me. I knew it was my grandfather, and I felt certain that he had come to take Dee over the Rainbow Bridge. In September of 2011, a friend of mine, Jack, who had been living out of state for 12 years, returned to New York. We agreed that he could stay with me for a while and help with the bills around the house. But from the moment he arrived on September 19th, something felt different. The atmosphere in my home seemed to change. That first night, after moving all his things in, Jack and his helpers stayed up talking about their trip. They spent hours chatting, and that's when Jack mentioned that my driveway felt unsettling. Now, I've lived in this house for almost 12 years, and I'd never thought twice about the driveway. I figured it was just because Jack had been living in a big city for so long, and maybe being out in the country felt strange to him at first. But he and his helpers talked about other odd things that happened during their trip, and I started feeling uneasy too, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The next 10 months turned into a strange mix of unsettling events around my house. For some reason, my driveway started to feel uncomfortable. I'm not normally afraid of the dark, but every night when I'd get out of my car, I felt like something was watching me from the woods. It wasn't just a feeling, it felt real, like something was lurking just out of sight. It got worse with each passing night. I began to carry a flashlight, which I'd never needed before. It was strange, because the feeling would go away as soon as I closed the gate behind me. On nights without a moon, though, it still felt like something was there, watching, but I could never explain it. The hair on the back of my neck would stand up, but it never followed me into the fenced-in areas of the yard. Inside the house, things were changing too. I'd always had a few odd occurrences before Jack moved in, but they were different, mostly harmless things, like hearing music with no clear source. It sounded like a CD on repeat, and sometimes I'd search the whole house and check all the radios, only to realize it was coming from outside. The sound would stay the same volume no matter where you were in the yard. A few times, someone would call my name, but I never saw anyone. Jack also started hearing someone call his name. He thought it was me at first, but I was never home when it happened. The voice sounded like a woman, and it always seemed to come from outside. There were 3 specific events that really stood out during the time Jack stayed with me. The first happened one afternoon when I was home alone. I heard footsteps in the kitchen and thought it was Jack, since his steps were always loud. When I called out, there was no answer. I got up to check, and the front door was wide open, but there was no sign of Jack. The kitchen was empty, and there was no explanation for the door being open. The second event took place around 1:30 a.m. I woke up suddenly, unsure of what had disturbed me. Then I heard a loud crash, like pans falling in the kitchen, and footsteps running down the hallway. The strange thing was, Jack couldn't move that fast, especially at night. The footsteps ran up and down the hall, stopping suddenly, just as quickly as it started. Jack later told me he'd heard the same sounds, though this was the only time I was awake for it. The last strange thing was even harder to explain. I lost my Kindle Paperwhite and couldn't find it anywhere. I searched the entire house, turned my bedroom upside down, and checked every drawer. Finally, I opened my dresser and pulled out some folded clothes. That's when I found the Kindle tucked between 2 pairs of pants, hidden in a way that seemed like someone had placed it there on purpose. The odd part? I had put the clothes in that drawer before the Kindle went missing. Jack also started feeling uneasy about the hallway outside his room. I'll admit, it's not the most comforting place, but Jack couldn't sleep unless the lights were on. I strung up fairy lights in the hallway to chase away the shadows, and put dream catchers in his room to help with the bad dreams he kept having. Eventually, he told me he felt like something was in the hallway, something with a strange smell, like wet dog or something wild. He even said he heard it growling. That night, I also smelled something odd, and for a moment I thought I heard a growl too. But I didn't want to believe it. Maybe it was just his imagination running wild. The strangest thing of all happened the day Jack moved out. The atmosphere in the house changed immediately. The place felt lighter, brighter. That night when I came home, even though it was dark, I didn't feel afraid in the driveway. The feeling of being watched was still there, but the fear was gone. It was as if whatever had been there before had disappeared. The next day, I heard the music again, the same sound I'd heard before, the one that had been missing for the past 10 months. It felt like everything was back to normal. So I'm left wondering, has anyone else ever experienced something like this? Where the presence of another person seems to stir up strange, unsettling things? Or maybe they brought something with them that triggered whatever was already there. I'm curious, because as far as I know, there's been no strange activity where Jack lives now. I've always been a bit sensitive to certain things. I can feel vibes in certain rooms, get a strong gut feeling about things, and I experience déjà vu a lot. Over the years, I've had several strange occurrences, but one that stands out from my childhood is hearing my name called. It was always very clear, and it sounded like a woman's voice. I would ask my mom why she was calling me, but she'd tell me she hadn't. This happened quite often, but I never thought much about it at the time. Recently, my dad asked me if I still had those dreams I used to have. I was confused at first, so I asked him what he meant. Apparently, when I was younger, I used to have frequent dreams about relatives I had never met, including my grandparents. In these dreams, I would even pass along messages to my parents, things about my grandparents that no one had told me. My dad told me that, for a while, he'd hear me talking to someone in my room. When he'd ask who I was talking to, I'd say, "Grandma," as if it was the most normal thing in the world. I don't remember most of this, just bits and pieces, but I think it's because my mom didn't like me talking about such things. She would tell me not to bring it up, while my dad was more supportive and open to it. He seemed genuinely interested in whether I had any messages from the past, so he asked me if those kinds of dreams still happened. This conversation got me wondering if there's something spiritual running in my family. It seems that a lot of us on my mom's side have had strange experiences, even going back to my great-grandmother. My mom finally told me a chilling story about something that happened to her, an encounter with a banshee. This might explain why she wasn't exactly thrilled when I started experiencing similar things. Every woman in my family, from my great-grandmother to my mom, has heard the cry of the banshee at some point. It's described as a loud, horrifying howling sound that fills the house, even echoing outside. It's said to be the banshee crying over someone's impending death. When my mom heard it, she was home alone, and the sound was so terrifying that it seemed to follow her around the house, no matter where she went. She checked every room, the basement, even outside, but couldn't find where it was coming from. After about an hour, right before my grandmother came home, it stopped. My mom waited outside, frightened, and explained what had happened. My grandmother was calm and told her that the women in our family are cursed to hear the cry of the banshee. A few days later, my great-grandmother passed away. Another eerie experience my mom had involved a strange omen. A few days before my grandfather died, my mom and grandmother were in the kitchen when my mom looked out the window and saw the entire yard covered with crows, so many that there was no bare ground. This was in late December, right before Christmas. A day or so later, my grandfather passed away suddenly from a heart attack. I haven't experienced anything like the banshee cry or such omens, but a lot of strange things have happened to me throughout my life. Just recently, I was at my boyfriend's house. He's had some paranormal experiences there too, which I've shared before. I was walking down the hallway when I noticed a bird sitting on the crown molding at the top of the stairs. I called my boyfriend to help me get it out of the house, and we both watched as the bird flew into a storage room. We saw it go behind an old dresser, but when I went in to check, the bird had completely vanished, no trace of it anywhere. We searched the house and made sure all the doors and windows were closed, but there was no way the bird could have gotten out. It was winter, so no windows were open. The strange thing is, I felt almost compelled to look up at the crown molding when I stepped into the hallway. How often do you notice something like that when you're just walking out of a room? I took this as a sign, though I'm not sure whether it was a good sign or a bad one, given my family's history with birds. I haven't had any dreams or messages from loved ones since my grandmother passed. The only time I remember feeling comforted by such a visit was when my grandmother came to me shortly after her death. She told me not to cry for her, that she was in a better place, and that she didn't want me to be sad. When I told my mom about it years later, she shared that, while she was still grieving and home alone, she heard my grandmother's voice call her name clearly, like she was trying to comfort her. Over the years, I've experienced many little things, those gut feelings, strange vibes in rooms, and odd coincidences, but nothing quite like what my family has gone through. So I'm left wondering, is it possible that the women in my family have some kind of spiritual sensitivity or abilities? Is there something following us, or is it just a part of our family's history? My mom's side is mostly of Irish and Ukrainian descent, and many of the things we've experienced align with certain cultural beliefs. I'd love to hear from anyone who's had similar experiences or has some insight into what's going on with our family. A few months ago, my friends and I, Patrick, Jeff, Chris, Tyler, and I, decided we wanted to go on a bigger camping trip. Up until then, we'd been camping near home, but we were all eager to try something new. So, this past weekend, from May 31st to June 2nd, we headed to the Phoenicia campground in upstate New York, and we planned to hike Nt. Tremper in Ulster County. We left around 2:40 p.m. on the 31st, after picking up Chris, who is still in high school, and arrived at the Phoenicia campground by 8:30 p.m. Once we set up camp, I made dinner, and we worked out who would take the first fire watch. The fire watch is when someone stays awake for an hour to keep an eye on the campfire and watch for any animals nearby. Tyler volunteered to take the first watch from 1 a.m. to 2 a.m., then Patrick from 2 a.m. to 3 a.m., Chris from 3 a.m. to 4 a.m., and I would take the last shift from 4 a.m. to 5 a.m. Afterward, I would wake everyone up for breakfast. During my watch, I made a pot of coffee on my camp stove and started preparing breakfast. As I finished setting up, I realized it was time to wake everyone up. We had breakfast together and spent some time sitting by the river, just enjoying the peaceful scenery. While we were sitting there, I noticed a bird flying about 40 feet above the water. To our surprise, it was a white horned owl, which we all thought was incredible. After breakfast, Patrick told us we'd be hiking up Mt. Tremper. I was really excited because I had never hiked a mountain before. We got our gear together around 8:30 a.m., but Tyler wasn't feeling well, so he decided to stay behind. I made sure he was comfortable at camp and left him with the water cooler and some crackers. Then the rest of us, Patrick, Chris, Jeff, and I, set off for the hike. In the beginning, Chris and Jeff found 2 large boulders on the incline of the mountain and called Patrick and me over to see the view. We weren't sure if we should leave the path, but the view was so beautiful that we decided to join them. After taking in the scenery, Patrick suggested we hike a bit further to the next path. However, we quickly realized that we had veered off course. We tried to retrace our steps but ended up getting lost. We were too far from the previous path, so we decided to keep going up, hoping we'd find another trail, but after a while, we were feeling fatigued and a bit dehydrated. Jeff found a large boulder to rest on, and Chris and I joined him to drink some water. Patrick, however, decided to keep going. He walked ahead for about 90 meters to see if he could find the path. While we waited, Jeff, Chris, and I joked about Patrick getting us lost and how we'd never find the trail again. Then, suddenly, we heard a woman's voice in the distance. At first, it sounded like a war cry, but then she began to sing. We couldn't understand what she was singing because it was in a Native American language, but the voice was beautiful and clear. The singing seemed to come from about 100 meters away, to our left, in the direction of the east. Patrick heard it too and looked around, but he didn't see anyone near us. It really freaked him out, especially because he's afraid of spirits. The strange singing gave us a burst of energy, and we decided to continue hiking. As we made our way forward, Jeff spotted a safety wire, which led us to an old, deserted campsite. The site looked like it hadn't been used in years. We all felt a sense of gratitude toward the spirit who had guided us there. After checking out the campsite, we kept going, and just 20 minutes later, we found the trail. We were relieved to discover that the trail was farther west, and it didn't pass near where we had heard the woman singing. This confirmed to all of us that the voice had to have been a spirit. Before we left for the trip, my mom had told me that our Native American ancestors came from this area, so I couldn't help but feel that they were watching over us. After all, the spirit's guidance helped us when we were lost and ready to give up. On the third day, we packed up our things and headed back home. It was bittersweet to leave because the place felt so peaceful, almost like home. But we all had to return to work on Monday. We agreed that we'd definitely come back one day to experience the tranquility of the Appalachian Mountains again. I'm so grateful to the spirit woman who helped us find our way, and I believe that her presence was a sign that our ancestors were looking out for us during our adventure. A few months ago, my nephew's father-in-law, Dan, passed away unexpectedly in his sleep. Out of respect for the family, I'll be changing names, but the story still carries an important and strange message. After Tim, my nephew, was discharged from the military, he had trouble finding work. So, he, his wife Carrie, and their 2 young daughters, Grace, almost 2, and newborn Sarah, moved back to New York from North Carolina. They moved in with Carrie's parents, Dan and Rita, which worked out well since Dan and Rita were empty nesters. Carrie's sisters were married and living with their own families. One night, after Dan passed, my nephew Tim called 911. The operator insisted that he perform CPR, but Carrie was screaming into the phone that her father was already gone. It was a devastating moment, and it seemed like the beginning of strange events. Not long after Dan's passing, Grace, their older daughter, began talking to someone who wasn't there. When Carrie and Rita asked who she was talking to, Grace replied, "Grandpa." At first, they thought it was just a case of Grace missing her grandpa, but then things started happening that made them wonder if there was more to it. Dan's radio would turn on by itself, sometimes even when no one was around. One day, when Carrie was home alone with the little ones, she tossed a towel over the back of a chair before going to check on them. When she returned, she found the towel neatly folded on the counter. There was no way the towel could have moved itself. Carrie knew it had been tossed carelessly moments before. These little things were starting to spook her. I heard all of this from my sister Elaine, who told me that Carrie gets really freaked out by the strange occurrences and often calls her to come over when she's alone at home. I told Elaine to advise Carrie, Tim, and Rita to just talk to Dan as if he were still there. It could help bring some peace and calm things down. Unfortunately, I can't speak to Carrie or Tim directly due to some unresolved issues from years ago, so I had to pass my advice through Elaine. For a few weeks, I didn't hear much more about the strange happenings. But last week, while I was talking to Elaine, she mentioned that weird things were still going on, though no one wanted to talk about it. I asked if these occurrences had happened to Carrie's sisters, but Elaine didn't know, so I couldn't say for sure. As we were talking about Dan and Rita, Elaine mentioned how, when Dan was alive, they were becoming known as the Bicker Sons, because they argued constantly. Not knowing the couple well, I said they seemed like a nice pair. Without missing a beat, Elaine replied, "Try taking a 5-hour car trip with them." I couldn't help but laugh. She then asked me why I was laughing, and I said, "Well, I can't now, unless he decided to come along," and Rita started arguing with his astral self. We both laughed, but there was an underlying seriousness to it. I imagined Dan might be sticking around to watch over his family, especially his granddaughters. He was still relatively young, only in his mid-60s, so maybe he's waiting for Rita to join him in the afterlife before he moves on. Given that Rita is in her mid-50s, it could be quite a wait before that happens. Tim had been working hard to save up money for a home for his family, but Rita asked them to stay with her a bit longer. I don't know if it's because she wants to be close to the grandchildren, or if she's afraid of the strange happenings at home, but it seems like she feels more comfortable having Tim and Carrie around for now. My name is Josh, I'm 21 years old, and I've lived in the same house my entire life. I live with my family, my mother, father, brother, sister, and my grandma, who actually owns the house. It's a modest home located in a suburban neighborhood on Long Island, New York. Over the years, I've had a number of strange experiences that I can't easily explain. While I wouldn't exactly label them as paranormal, I've always felt a certain unease in the house, especially when it came to sleeping in my room. For a period of time, I shared that room with my brother, and there was this constant feeling that something was watching me. It wasn't a fear of the dark, but more of an overwhelming sense that something was present, even when I was alone. The layout of the house is relatively simple. When you walk through the front door, there are steps that lead up to the bathroom, 2 rooms, one of which was once my shared bedroom, and the master bedroom where my grandma stays. To the right is the living room, straight ahead is the kitchen, and the dining room is off to the right corner. There's another flight of stairs that leads down to the den, which also has a bathroom. At the base of those steps, there's a door that leads to the basement. One of my earliest experiences occurred when I was very young, probably no older than 10. This was before I had ever experimented with drugs or anything that could explain what I saw. We were all in the living room, and my mom asked me to go to the basement to grab a pair of socks that were kept on an old dresser next to the washer and dryer. As I was picking up the socks, I froze in my tracks. At the far end of the basement, near the boiler, I saw what I can only describe as an apparition. It looked human-shaped, but its body was more like a distortion, similar to the way light bends above a hot grill or a lighter flame. It was almost like a living flame, not exactly a shadow like many people describe in ghost stories. I stared at it for a good 5 seconds, but then I bolted up the stairs, terrified. I'm not sure if I told my family about it at the time, but they know about it now. The second experience occurred a few years later when my brother hadn't moved into the den yet. At the base of the stairs leading down to the den, there's a very old, rusty door that leads to the garage. It's a difficult door to open because the metal has gotten stuck in the frame over the years, so an adult male really has to yank on it to open it. One evening, I was sitting in the den, probably just on my phone, when I heard the door fly open. It opened as though someone kicked it from the inside of the garage. The main garage door was still closed, and I immediately thought someone had broken in. I ran downstairs, grabbed a bat, and took my dog by the collar as I approached the door. I opened it, only to find the garage empty. No one was there. It was so freaky, I couldn't even explain what happened. Another experience happened when I was trying to sleep upstairs. I had been sleeping alone in the basement, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, so I moved to the living room to sleep on the couch. My dog was lying beside me, and I was hoping the presence I felt would go away. But as I was lying there, I heard footsteps coming from the den, walking across the living room and toward the couch where I was lying. The footsteps got closer and closer until I felt a cold, heavy presence standing right in front of me. My dog, who had been lying still, suddenly looked up at something that was there. It was terrifying. More recently, I've been sleeping in my parents' room again because the sensation of being watched came back with full force. The first few nights were fine. I slept on some cushions on the floor without a problem. But then the strange sounds started again, banging noises from the living room, and what distinctly sounded like footsteps going up and down the stairs. I thought maybe I was just hearing things, but it felt so real. I tried closing the door to block it out, hoping that whatever it was wouldn't follow me. For a night or two, that seemed to work, and I was able to sleep. But after a while, the noises became louder and more persistent, and at this point, I was certain I was hearing something go up and down the steps erratically, with a few steps up, one down, two up, definitely not the usual way someone climbs stairs. This was very disturbing, and I began to lose sleep again. One night, while I was lying down, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were much closer. I was facing the door and listening intently when something happened that sent a chill down my back. I heard 2 loud footsteps right outside the door, as if someone had just stopped right there. Then the doorknob rattled for a moment. All my pets, my dog and 2 cats, suddenly turned and stared at the door. It freaked me out completely, so I locked the door. The nights that followed were just as uncomfortable. I kept hearing banging sounds and footsteps between 12 and 4 in the morning. I also started hearing whispers as I lay there, and at times, I would feel cold drafts of air, even though no windows were open. I also began to feel my sheets being tugged at slowly. I could distinctly feel a force pulling on them, which was extremely unsettling. Those are my experiences. I'd also like to mention that I've heard whispers in almost every room I've slept in at some point. I've also felt depressions on my bed, as if someone had just sat down beside me, and I've had moments where I felt the bed moving, as though someone was crawling across it. There have even been times when my bed was knocked into, as though someone had stumbled against it. A bit about myself: I'm a Christian, and I've accepted Jesus Christ as my Savior. But I admit I've done things in my life that I know are not godly, things like cussing, lying, stealing, doing drugs, and other sins. I'm not perfect, just like everyone else. A few years ago, I suffered from sleep paralysis almost every night, but it ended when I prayed and screamed, "Jesus Christ," at the demons I would see in that state. I believe, though I know some may not agree, that all hauntings and paranormal activity are demonic. My spiritual beliefs come from a biblical understanding, which teaches that human souls either go to heaven or hell. There's no such thing as a spirit lingering on earth to be helped into the light. I don't believe in using herbs, stones, or other methods to deal with spirits. I believe the only way to banish these things is through calling on Christ and God. I'm not writing this to ask for help, but more to share my experiences with others, hoping to confirm that paranormal activity is very real. I'm also curious to hear others' thoughts on the matter. I'm really confused about my ghost experience. I'm not sure if it was a ghost, a spirit, or a demon. Here's how it all started. It began when I was in 7th grade. My days were normal, but then one night I had a terrifying nightmare. Usually, when I wake up from a nightmare in the middle of the night, I can go back to sleep without a problem. But this time, I was too scared to go back to bed. When I woke up, I saw that it was exactly 3:33 a.m. I tried not to think too much of it, figuring it was just a coincidence. I was exhausted, so I went back to sleep. The next day went fine, but that night, as I was getting ready to sleep, I remembered the nightmare and felt uneasy. I tried to ignore the fear and went to sleep anyway. But the same thing happened. I woke up again at 3:33 a.m., feeling scared. This time, I was more concerned, but I just went back to sleep, hoping it was just a fluke. Then, the third night came, and it happened again, another nightmare, and again I woke up at exactly 3:33. But this time, I noticed a pattern. In every nightmare, there was a monster killing someone, and the whole thing was from a third-person perspective. The next morning, it was a Saturday, and I told my mom about what had been happening. To my surprise, she told me she had also been having nightmares, waking up at 3 a.m. She also mentioned that she'd felt a slap on her forehead during the night, even though my stepdad was passed out beside her. We were both pretty freaked out by this point. One night, I was sleeping in my old room when it happened again. I woke up from yet another nightmare, and as I lay in bed, I was facing the closet, which had a sliding mirror door. I couldn't sleep, so I started staring at the reflection in the mirror, trying to calm myself down. That's when I saw something strange. A large, frisbee-like object seemed to fly upwards in the reflection, moving left, then disappearing. It looked thick and strange, but I couldn't explain what it was. I closed my eyes after that, too scared to look again. Then, one night, I decided to sleep in my brother's room, hoping for a change. Again, the same thing happened, another nightmare, and I woke up at 3:33 a.m., too scared to go back to sleep. I remember closing the door before I fell asleep, but when I glanced at the door later, it was halfway open. As I stared at it, I saw something, a dog or some kind of animal on all fours. It started running toward me. When it got close, it disappeared. I felt an intense wave of fear wash over me. The animal seemed ghostly, almost like fog. I started seeing strange things in mirrors. It was hard to describe, but it was like there was something there without form. Whenever I didn't see it, it felt like something was watching me, and there were times I felt like it was right behind me. Then, it would try to attack me. Other times, I'd hear footsteps, followed by low, distant screams. But when I tried to pinpoint where it was coming from, the noises would stop. One of the most terrifying things was when my bed would shake. It wasn't like the usual creaks or settling sounds you'd hear in a house. It was rapid, violent shaking. It moved so fast that I knew it wasn't just the house shifting. I'd sit up, and when I realized my bed was shaking, it would stop. But if I ignored it and laid back down, the shaking would get harder and more intense, making me even more scared. At this point, I was so terrified that I told my mom everything. She got concerned and called my stepdad's mom to tell her what was going on, how she was having nightmares, how I was waking up at 3:33 a.m., and how my bed kept shaking. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention, after some of these events, I would wake up with scratches on my face or arms, as if something had physically marked me. After hearing all of this, my mom decided to bless the house with holy water. She performed a blessing, and after that day, everything changed. I never experienced the 3:33 nightmares again, and I stopped seeing the strange things in the mirrors. I still get nightmares from time to time, but they no longer have that same eerie feeling, and I never wake up at 3:33 a.m. anymore. Let me start by saying that for a long time, I thought the strange things happening to me were just normal occurrences that everyone experiences. It wasn't until later that I realized the black figures and eerie events in my house were unlike anything my friends had experienced. At first, I wasn't scared, but as these black figures continued to appear, I felt the need to share my story. It all started when I was moving into our new home. It was a Tuesday, and we had just finished bringing everything in. I went to put my things in the closet. When I opened the door and turned around to grab my items, I noticed the closet door had closed. At first, I thought I must have bumped into it by accident, but it seemed odd to me. I was only 11 at the time, and I didn't think much of it. I decided to open the door with my foot to avoid touching it, and as I did, one of my favorite candles on the bookshelf fell into a box and shattered. The box was empty, and I thought nothing of it until I realized the floor was wooden. I went to grab the box, and as I did, both my bedroom door and the closet door slammed shut at once. I assumed it was the wind from an open window. A few days later, on the night of my 12th birthday, I had a party with a few friends. Being a bit of a tomboy, the theme was based on Transformers. We were hanging out, watching a movie, Deep Blue, but when we tried to play the DVD, it wouldn't work. We had just gotten it the day before, and when I took it out, I found it was hot to the touch. It had actually burned me a little and was increasing in heat. I unplugged the DVD player, thinking it was malfunctioning, but when I touched it, the player was cold. There was no explanation for why the disc had gotten so hot, so I ended up running it under water, which, of course, ruined it. Skip forward to the start of 7th grade, and I was still 12. I had learned a bit more about spirits by then, but I still didn't find it all that scary. I wasn't really afraid of ghosts or spirits because nothing had ever really hurt me, so why should I be scared? One morning, my bus schedule was changed, and I had to wait at home for the bus to pick me up. I was the last one to leave the house, since my mom would drive my siblings to their high school first. While waiting, I heard strange rattling noises coming from the kitchen, like the sound of cabinets opening and shaking. Then came the tapping, first on the counters, then on the plates. I thought I was imagining things, but when I went to check, I saw scratch marks on the plates. It was unsettling, but I tried to stay calm. I looked around the kitchen and found that all the forks and spoons had been shuffled around. I then heard more tapping coming from my room, so I went to check. In my room, there were more scratch marks on the wall. I didn't know what to think, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. I had to catch the bus. When I got on the bus, I sat next to my best friend, Nathan. He was upset because he was always the first one picked up, and I was the 5th. As we talked, he suddenly stopped and started crying. He didn't have any conditions like bipolar disorder, so I was confused. Then he said, "That really hurt. What just hit me?" I turned to look at him, and his head was bleeding. Not a lot, but there was blood. I rushed to tell the bus driver what had happened, and we ended up getting the kid who had been sitting behind us in trouble. I felt bad about that, but I had no idea how Nathan's head got injured. A few years later, things got even stranger. One night, I woke up around 1 a.m. and felt my mouth dry. I sat up and saw something moving in the room. I first thought it was my little sister, but she was too young to be awake at that time. I kept staring at the figure, which seemed to be running back and forth. The strange part was that it wasn't making any noise at all. It was running on wooden floors but making no sound. Suddenly it stopped, stood still in front of me, giggled, and then ran toward the window, disappearing. I went back to sleep but woke up again around 5 a.m. I had a strong feeling that someone was watching me. I looked out of my door and saw a dark, featureless figure standing in front of the bathroom door. I froze, terrified, and pulled the covers over my head, hoping it would go away. When I peeked out from under the blanket, the figure was still there, right in front of me. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. The figure then reached out with what appeared to be a finger and scratched down my chest. It left a visible scratch, and I could feel the blood, but I was too focused on the figure itself. It wasn't just terrifying, it felt wrong. The figure disappeared, heading toward the living room, where my oldest sister, Macy, had been sleeping. I rushed to find her, but when I got to the living room, she had woken up and was screaming. She had seen the same thing I had, the same black figure. She showed me a scratch on her chest, just like mine. We couldn't afford to move, so we stayed in the house, but the strange occurrences didn't stop there. A few days later, Nathan came over to visit, and we were hanging out in the living room when he asked, "Do you hear that clicking noise?" I shrugged it off, thinking it was the neighbors, but he said, "It sounds like it's coming from your closet." My heart skipped a beat. I asked him if he heard it from the closet, or just from that direction. He confirmed it was coming from the closet. I immediately opened the door, but it slammed shut in my face. When I tried to pull it open, something on the other side was fighting against me. Nathan didn't believe me at first, and tried to open the door himself, but it wouldn't budge. After a few moments, he gave it one final strong pull, and the door flew open, causing him to stumble backward into me, knocking over a bookshelf. Nathan was shaken and said, "Catherine, I am so sorry. Something was pulling on the other side of the door." I didn't know what to think, but when we looked behind the bookshelf, Nathan noticed something strange, a splintered part of the shelf that I hadn't seen before. I didn't know if it had always been there or if something else was going on. This is more of a small experience I had, nothing big or dramatic, but I think it's interesting enough to share. I was in New York City on a haunted tour, one of those walking tours where you hear ghost stories from your guide. Since I'm into all things supernatural, I was loving every minute of it, especially hearing about all the spooky activities in the older parts of the city. We heard tales about terrible murders and restless spirits that still haunt the places where they occurred. We even visited one of the oldest graveyards in the city. Though I didn't see anything there, I did take some pictures, and I'm fairly certain I caught some ghostly faces peeking out from the gates. But it was when we reached Gay Street that something strange happened. This street is famous for its connection to the 1920s, mainly because the mayor of New York City at the time, a notorious party animal, had a mistress who lived on this street, and they hosted parties there regularly. There are reports of people seeing a man in a top hat, strutting down the street with a cane, much like the mayor did in his life. How extra, right? I love it! When we reached Gay Street, I was pretty excited. I'm a fan of the 1920s, and I'd heard a lot about this particular mayor. Honestly, I was half expecting to see him taking a leisurely stroll down the street, cane in hand, but of course, I didn't. However, I did see something else. After hearing the stories, I turned to take another look at the house that had hosted all those wild parties. As I scanned the street, I saw something very clearly, an arm in the window. It was bent at an angle, almost as if it was dancing, like the "walk like an Egyptian" move with the wrist turned out. It looked like a shadow or a silhouette, but it was incredibly clear despite that. I watched it move for a few seconds, and just as I was about to tell someone else what I had seen, I looked back and it was gone. I don't usually get scared when I see things like this. Honestly, I usually just feel a sense of excitement. So, I was pretty hyped up about what I had seen. I took a lot of pictures of the house from the outside, but I didn't catch any arms or anything else strange in the photos. I thought I might have seen an orb, but it was probably just the light reflecting in a weird way. Then, a couple of months later, I was showing my friend the pictures and telling her about the arm I saw when she pointed something out. She zoomed in on the top floor window of the house, and there, faintly, we could see what appeared to be a man's face looking out. He looked like some sort of captain, wearing that classic sailor's hat. We checked all the photos and, sure enough, the face appeared in most of them. It seemed to move a little, probably because of the angle of the shots. I was shocked. I looked at those pictures so many times before and hadn't noticed anything. I guess sometimes you need a fresh set of eyes to spot things, especially when you're too focused on looking for an arm. It's weird to think that this spirit, or spirits, might have been there all along, and I never saw them until later. I wonder how many spirits are still in that house and why they chose to stay there. Honestly, if I could spend my afterlife at a never-ending party, I'd probably stick around too. It seems like a very of the day way to go. I didn't get any bad vibes from the house. It didn't feel sinister at all. It just felt like a big party that never had to end. I guess if you're a spirit, that's not a bad way to spend eternity. I've had some strange experiences over the years, but what happened last May really stuck with me. It all started with an entity I had been seeing, which I initially thought was either my grandfather or my father-in-law. However, I soon realized it couldn't be either of them, because I didn't get that warm, comforting feeling I usually get when either of them is around. I also never saw the entity's face. It only showed me its back, as if it didn't want me to see it. I couldn't even tell if the figure was male or female. My basement stairs have no handrails, something my husband removed years ago because the old ones were dangerous. I had asked him to put them back up since my back surgery last year, but he said it was easier to bring large items down without the handrails. Despite my concerns, I had never fallen down the stairs. He didn't want me going up and down too much, but I had to go down to the basement occasionally. That all changed after I started seeing the entity. One day, I was about to go up the stairs, but I changed my mind because I needed something from the basement. I've been having problems with my left knee, and as I stepped down, it locked up. I called for my husband to help me, but before he could get to me, my back also locked up. I was in danger of falling, and I wanted him to stop me before I went down. Instead of falling straight down the stairs, which would have been preferable, since I was only on the 4th step from the bottom, I fell through where the handrails should have been. Somehow, I avoided hitting my head on a dresser that was in my path, but I ended up landing over 6 feet away from the stairs. My husband, who had just stood there watching, asked me why I did that. I was in pain and upset, so I told him I called for help, but there was no handrail to stop me from falling. He didn't say much, but it was clear he didn't believe me. A week later, something even stranger happened. I was in the basement talking to my sons, and when I started to go up the stairs in my work boots, my right boot slipped off the step. I lost my balance and ended up falling flat on my stomach. Once again, I went flying through the hole where the handrail should have been, and I landed on my back, more than 6 feet away from the stairs. There were so many things I should have hit on the way down, yet I didn't. My older son rushed over to help me, but I was still winded and hadn't moved. My younger son and I have a system for helping me get up if I fall, and he assisted me. When I started to recover, my older son made a nervous joke about how much air I got on the way down, like maybe I landed further than I thought. Honestly, it felt like something pushed me the first time, and something flipped me the second time. It was as if I wasn't in full control of my body. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That same month, my dog, Baldur, started acting strangely. Baldur was a huge dog, around 145 pounds, and that day, he seemed to be panting more heavily than the others. The weather was still chilly, and I knew he hadn't shed his winter coat yet. I wanted to take him to the vet, but my husband told me it was nothing. The next day, Baldur seemed worse. He came up to me and buried his head in my lap, which is how dogs let you know they're not feeling well. He started coughing soon after, and I knew something was seriously wrong. I called my husband, but he insisted I wait. I was beside myself with worry, so I stayed up all night with my adult children, anxiously watching over Baldur. Around 4 a.m., he yelped loudly, coughed, and collapsed, with fluid coming out of his mouth. My husband hurried to get dressed to take him to the emergency vet, but I angrily told him, "It's too late. Baldur is gone." Later that morning, I called the vet's office, where I'd been a client for over 30 years. The vet tech, Mike, spoke to me, and I explained Baldur's symptoms. He told me that Baldur had likely died from congestive heart failure. He also said that even if I had gotten him to the vet sooner, there was nothing they could have done. I looked at my husband, frustrated, and said, "At the very least, we could have had him humanely euthanized." The experience left me feeling empty, and the grief weighed heavily on me. Now, here's where things started to get stranger. I've always been sensitive to energy, so I often say a warding prayer before bed, especially when I feel off. My daughter also says a warding prayer nightly. During my last back surgery, I had an experience I describe as feeling like I was floating towards my family's voices, but something felt like an anchor, pulling me back. It was as if death was near, but couldn't take me. And when I had those strange falls and began seeing that entity, I couldn't shake the feeling that death was close. I began to wonder if the entity had come for me but left after Baldur died. A year and a half later, my older daughter passed away suddenly at 28, just hours before she was supposed to be released from the hospital. The grief of losing her was overwhelming, and I can't help but wonder if the White Lady, or whatever presence I felt at the time, had been a warning, an inevitable presence that was, in some way, linked to the grief and loss I had been experiencing. I'll never know for sure, but the sense of connection to something larger than myself, something that transcends the boundaries of life and death, has stayed with me. Baldur's passing and the strange events surrounding it remain a reminder that sometimes, even the most ordinary of moments can be touched by something far beyond our understanding. When I was 15 years old, I experienced something that I've never forgotten, and I've shared it with anyone who would listen. Some people laughed it off, suggesting I was just tired from my busy lifestyle, being a gymnast, a dancer, and constantly traveling for sleepaway camp. But others who believed me became afraid to come to my home, or simply avoided me. To this day, I know what I experienced was real, and after speaking to a priest, his advice did help, though it took a week for the situation to resolve. At the time, I was living with my adopted mother, who was originally from the UK and wasn't religious. I had a lot of people from various religious backgrounds approach me, including a cult group that I considered joining. My mother forbade me to get involved, warning me that nothing good would come of it. While I didn't join, I did hold on to the religion I was born into, Catholicism. One night, I went to bed, and everything seemed normal. There was no reason I could think of for what happened next. My twin captain's bed was against the back wall, with a window beside it and a radiator under the window. I was lying there, when suddenly I felt an intense cold chill down my back. It lingered, as though a cold body were lying next to me in the bed. I knew the window was closed, so I felt an intense fear. I tried to get out of bed but found myself frozen, unable to move. Eventually, I managed to get up and turn to look at the bed. The covers were still raised, as if a body had been lying there. In a panic, I rushed to the light switch by the door, turned it on, and looked back at the bed. The covers fell flat, and whatever it was gone. I told my mother, but of course, she didn't believe me, A few days later, I was sitting in her bedroom, watching TV in her desk chair. To my left was her platform bed, and I could see under it. While I was watching the program, I noticed a swirling, black effect under the bed. It started small but grew larger, eventually looking like a black hole. I stared at it, unable to scream, as it continued to expand. The furniture didn't fall into the hole, but I couldn't look away. I eventually jumped up from the chair, terrified, and fled the room. The fear and confusion I felt were overwhelming. I couldn't explain what I was seeing, but it felt wrong, deeply wrong. The next event, however, was the most disturbing. That night, I woke up to find my mother standing at the foot of my bed. Her face was blank, her eyes vacant, as though something else was inside her. It felt like she wasn't herself. I told her calmly, "Leave. I need to sleep." And she slowly turned around and walked out of the room without saying a word. I knew, deep in my heart, that something evil was present in our apartment. In a panic, I barricaded my bedroom door, determined not to let her, or whatever was inside her, come back in. I slept on the floor, far from the window, just trying to stay safe. The next day, I went to the Catholic Church, desperate for help. In the confession booth, I told the priest what had been happening. He listened carefully and gave me a bottle of holy water, a Bible with passages circled, and a small wooden rosary. I was only 15, but I knew I had to act. I went around the apartment, following the priest's instructions. The worst part was my mother's bedroom. It felt like there was some sort of resistance in that room. I felt nauseous but continued, sprinkling holy water as I was told. Over the next few days, the fear did not subside. I still couldn't bring myself to walk past my mother's room without feeling a deep, unsettling dread. It was as if something was still pulling at me. Eventually, the occurrences stopped, but the fear never fully left. Even as I moved on, whenever I walked past that room, the fear would return, and I would run by it, afraid I might be pulled back into whatever had taken hold. To this day, I don't know why I was chosen to experience those things, but I know it was real. Since then, I've experienced other paranormal events, each one different, and in different homes I've lived in. I often wonder why these things happen to me, but I'm grateful that none of these experiences have returned when I visited my mother. The house I live in was built in 1902 by the same man who constructed the house next door. The house next door was his personal home. Before our house was built, the family next door used our lot as a dumping ground. If you dig down a foot, you'll find a layer of ash from their fireplace. Dig deeper, and you start pulling up shards of porcelain, so well preserved that you can still make out gold and silver details. When we first moved in, there was an old carriage barn in our backyard, complete with a feed trough. Unfortunately, the barn had been poorly maintained over the years and had become too dangerous to enter, so my father had to tear it down. We've done a lot of work on the house since moving in. We had to remove all the horsehair plaster in the walls because it caused drafts, and we replaced most of the windows, as well as all of the original wallpaper. The place has a lot of history, and sometimes I feel like the house holds on to that history in ways I can't fully explain. A lot of my feelings of being watched tend to happen in certain parts of the house. My father's office, which used to be the front parlor, the upstairs bathroom where the wall between the toilet and shower is, in front of the basement door, and in front of my bedroom door. Sometimes the sensation gets so intense that I can't turn my back on those areas. It's hard to explain, but the feeling of being watched feels like it's coming from the house itself. My town has its own share of history that may explain some of these strange occurrences. It was the site of 2 military encampments, one during the French and Indian War and another during the War of 1812. The land was purchased from the local Native American tribe in the 17th century, and there are stories, as well as physical evidence, of Native American raids throughout the area. The nearby city, which I can literally walk to, is known for its haunted locations, with one of its most notable stories coming from a 16th century outpost where French soldiers attacked during the winter. The attack resulted in half of the settlement's population being killed or captured, and those who survived were forced to walk through the wilderness in their night clothes, leading to even more deaths. The bodies of the victims are buried in a nearby cemetery, and there are stories of statues in that cemetery moving on their own. In addition to that cemetery, there are 3 other graveyards near my home. One is large and I often walked past it on my way to elementary school. Another is small and very old, with no more than 10 headstones, located a few blocks from the center of town, just behind my house. The third is so close that I can see it from my front porch, just in front of an old church. This is the one that causes me the most concern. Every now and then, as I'm about to go upstairs, I find myself glancing out the window of the front door, checking the entrance of the church parking lot. I'd never really been able to walk through it, and I actively avoid it if I find myself walking home after dark. I'm sharing this now because things around the house have calmed down recently. But this past Easter, my mother gave me several bags of Easter candy. One of them was a bag of Skittles, my favorite candy. That night, I was thinking about opening the bag and having a few, but every time I thought about eating a Skittle, I got this vivid image in my mind of myself choking on it. It was so clear that I immediately backed off from even opening the bag. Up until these past few years, my house was quite paranormally active. Many of my past experiences have already been shared here. But what I haven't posted yet is that sometimes, when I go to open a door, I'll get the feeling that I shouldn't open it, not yet at least. It's as though there's something not so nice on the other side. Along with that feeling, I'll get a mental image of a tall black shadow standing just on the other side of the door. It's not a threatening feeling, but it's a sense of caution, like something I'm not supposed to face just yet. These strange experiences, combined with the history of the land and the house, have always left me wondering if there's something more going on. I'm not sure why these things seem to happen to me, but I know there's something to it. The more I experience, the more I wonder if these spirits, or energies, are connected to the land itself. I'm not sure what's still lingering in my home or if it will ever truly leave, but the strange occurrences and feelings I get suggest there's still something here that I don't fully understand. After I graduated from college, my friends and I were a bit tapped out. Our finances were tight. However, we lived in Buffalo, a city known for its many old apartments that rented cheaply. One of my friends and his new wife were looking for a place to live, and I went along with them to check out an apartment they were considering renting. I don't remember much about the apartment itself, except for one thing: when we walked into the living room, I had to leave immediately. There was something unnatural in the room, a palpable sense of unease. I didn't say anything to my friends at the time because I didn't want them to think I was crazy or to put a negative spin on a place they had decided to make their new home. But deep down, I was sure that apartment was haunted. A few weeks later, while we were hanging out at a mutual friend's house, my friends jokingly said, "I think our apartment is haunted." My heart skipped a beat. They began sharing some of the strange things that had been happening there, like one night when they were asleep, and the bedroom light suddenly turned itself on. I remember that detail the most, but there were other odd occurrences too. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I told them, "I knew it! I thought it was haunted!" They looked at me, wide-eyed, and then we all started talking about it more openly. Later, I moved into a different apartment in Buffalo. This one was a nice, 3-bedroom place in the North End. It was a quiet building, and I was excited to start unpacking. But almost immediately, something strange happened. While I was putting away my things, I heard a loud crash coming from the bathroom cupboard. I ran to see what had fallen, but when I looked inside, all the towels were still neatly folded as I had placed them. There was nothing in there that could have made that noise. I couldn't explain it. The landlord and his wife lived downstairs in the 2-family house, so I mentioned it casually when I saw them next. I joked, "I didn't know I'd be sharing the apartment with a ghost." I expected them to laugh or ask what I meant, but instead, they exchanged a strange look. Then they said, "Oh, he's up there now?" I asked them what they meant, and they told me they had experienced strange things in the house too. One story they shared was about the time they had a pool table in the basement. All the pool sticks had been hanging on a rack, but one night, they all suddenly fell off the rack at the same time. There were other stories too, but it was clear they weren't just telling ghost stories. They genuinely believed something was going on in the house. There was also a coat closet in the living room, near where I had my TV. Every time I would leave the room and come back, the closet door would be open. I made sure to close it tightly, so I knew it was fully shut, but every time, it was open when I returned. At first, I wasn't scared, just confused. Over time, I became convinced that the spirit, who I believed was a friendly one, was just playing tricks on me. It was like they were just being mischievous, nothing malevolent. One day, while I was vacuuming, the vacuum suddenly turned itself off, like the power switch was flipped on its own. I wasn't scared, but I did say aloud, "Stop it! I'm busy right now, and I don't appreciate your jokes." I didn't really expect an answer, but it was almost as if I was communicating with whatever presence was in the house. One evening, my brother and his wife came to visit, and we had a barbecue with the landlords and the neighbors. As we swapped stories about our ghostly experiences, the neighbors mentioned that the people who lived there before us had also felt the presence of something strange in the house. At one point, my cigarettes and matches were sitting on the table. The cover of the matchbook was closed, with the matches lying on top of the pack. Out of nowhere, the matches caught fire, all at once, with no explanation. I immediately said, "Oh, I think our ghosts don't want us talking about them." Around this time, the landlord's young son had been having recurring nightmares about the house burning down. It was unsettling. After hearing his story, I made a promise to the ghosts. I told them that I would stop smoking if they promised not to play with matches anymore. Surprisingly, after that, the boy stopped having nightmares, and I did, in fact, quit smoking. After moving out of Buffalo, I lived in newer townhouses, and I haven't had any ghostly visitors since. But those experiences in Buffalo have stuck with me. I truly believe that old homes, especially ones with so much history, can hold on to something. I'm not sure what it is, but I've felt the presence of something beyond the physical world in every place I've lived. And after all the paranormal experiences I've had, I've come to accept that some of these things may never be fully explained. This happened when I was a teenager, many years ago, in upstate New York, where I grew up. At the time, I had a rather bizarre friend who, despite his own experiences with the supernatural, many of them unpleasant, insisted on explaining everything away with logic and reason. It used to frustrate me to no end, especially because he would apply this to everything, even cartoons and shows we watched. It sort of ruined the wonder and imagination for me. I've always been fascinated by ghost stories and the supernatural, and I've always been open-minded but with a healthy dose of skepticism. One day, my friend and I were having a discussion about the paranormal. I was tired of him dismissing every story I brought up, so I found one that I thought he couldn't explain away with his logic. I found a story in a book on ghost tales that seemed perfect. The story involved a man's ghost being seen by several people many miles away from where he had been killed. There was evidence to back up the sightings, and I was sure this would be the one that would win the argument for me. We talked about it for a while, and the day was sunny and warm. It was a pretty normal setting, with my parents downstairs. My house was not considered haunted at all, or at least, I didn't think so. But as we talked, I began to feel something strange in the atmosphere of my room. It started off subtly, but I noticed it right away. I tried to push it aside, focusing on the conversation, but it was as if the room itself had begun to change. The air felt heavy, and suddenly it didn't feel safe or comfortable anymore. It wasn't threatening, but it was definitely off, like something was there, unseen. My friend, who had been talking just a moment before, suddenly went silent. His face went blank, and he stopped speaking. I hadn't mentioned how I was feeling, but when I went to say something else, he stopped me and said, "Wait." I looked at him and blurted out, "Do you feel that too?" He nodded, his eyes wide in shock. At that point, we decided to leave the room. Whatever was happening felt too uncomfortable to ignore. It didn't feel evil or dark, but it was as if we had been enveloped in something, like a heavy cloud that didn't belong. It was unsettling. We quickly moved down the hall and went downstairs, but whatever it was, it still seemed to follow us. I can still clearly remember the scene in my mind. My mom was sitting on the couch, looking distracted, but as I talked to her, it felt as if there was a barrier between us. I could see her, hear her, but it was like she was separated from us by some invisible field. The afternoon sun was still pouring through the window behind her, and everything felt so off, like we weren't quite in the real world anymore. We went outside to the garage, but the feeling didn't lift. It was as if we had stepped into a different world. The usual sounds of the neighborhood were gone, no children playing, no birds chirping, and the usual hum of the street was completely muted. I couldn't feel the sunshine, and it was as though I was cut off from reality. It was like walking through a fog, but it wasn't a physical fog, it was more of a mental disconnect. At that point, I started to panic, not because I was scared of whatever presence might be there, but because it felt like reality itself had been altered. It felt like we were stuck in some kind of limbo. My friend, too, looked as confused as I was, and we both just started walking down the street, trying to get away from it. And then it happened. We reached the first intersection, and it was as if we had stepped through a curtain. The oppressive feeling lifted in an instant. We were suddenly back in the real world. The air felt normal, the sun was warm again, and all the sounds of the street returned, children playing, birds chirping, and the distant hum of life. It was like the veil had been lifted, and we were free. We both stopped and looked at each other, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But we couldn't. We couldn't explain it. I was shaken up, and my friend was too, though we both tried to act normal. We never really talked about it after that. I went back home, and when I returned to my room, the familiar warmth and safety of it had returned. The feeling was gone, and everything was normal again. I later asked my mom if she had noticed anything unusual when I had talked to her that day, but she just said I seemed subdued. That was the only comment she made. To this day, I still don't have a rational explanation for what happened. The feeling of unreality was so distinct, like being in a dream or somewhere between worlds. It's hard to describe, but it didn't feel like my fear. It felt like an external force had altered reality itself. I'm somewhat empathic, so I've had experiences where I've picked up on others' emotions, but this was different. The sensation of unreality was like nothing I'd ever felt before. In hindsight, I can only guess that discussing the supernatural so openly that day might have attracted something. Maybe the story I told stirred something up, or maybe it was just a spirit or entity curious about our conversation. I don't know, but I'm certain that whatever happened was real. It remains one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. This event also shaped my beliefs in the supernatural and how certain experiences, whether with ghosts or energies, can completely change your perception of reality. It's something I still think about from time to time, and I've learned not to take the unexplained lightly. When I was a teenager, I had a bizarre experience at my grandfather's house in upstate New York. My grandfather was a simple man who lived in a house that had been passed down through the family. It was an old place, full of memories and history, but also, I think, full of something else. The house was always a special place for me growing up. I spent weekends there, especially when my parents were busy. My grandfather was always kind and doting. He had an old-fashioned way of doing things, everything from his decor to his old-fashioned tools and antiques, and I loved spending time there. But there was always something off about the house, a sense of unease I couldn't shake, even as a kid. The house was pretty typical for its time, an old, creaky structure with hardwood floors, a basement, and an upstairs that always felt off-limits. My grandfather had added a basement and expanded the second floor over the years, but some parts of the house remained unchanged. The bathroom was tiny, the hallways were narrow, and the upstairs felt like it was stuck in another time. But it wasn't just the physical layout that felt strange. Sometimes I could feel a presence there, like I wasn't truly alone, even though no one else was around. As a teen, I didn't really talk much about it, brushing off my uneasy feelings as normal childhood imagination. That is, until one specific day when I was 16. It started innocently enough. My brother and I had found an old Ouija board in the garage at our childhood home. The box was dusty and the board was worn, but it piqued our curiosity. I didn't know much about Ouija boards at the time, but my brother had seen enough horror movies to know exactly what it was. He insisted we try it out. So, in the quiet of the house, we set up the board in the basement and began our session. We didn't expect anything to happen, but I was fascinated. After some initial goofing around, we began to get some strange responses. The planchette moved on its own, spelling out messages that didn't make sense at first, but the more we used it, the more we became convinced that something, or someone, was communicating with us. One of the names that came up in the messages was unfamiliar to me. It was a name I didn't recognize, but the messages started to get darker. They mentioned things like death, betrayal, and the truth is buried. My brother, who had been so excited, became visibly shaken, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Then, something happened that I can't explain. The air in the room shifted, and it felt like the house itself had become different. The energy was heavy, and I remember feeling a strange coldness that I couldn't shake. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and suddenly, I had the undeniable feeling that something was watching us. I looked at my brother, but he was just as spooked. We packed up the board and left the basement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. That night, my brother asked to sleep in my room. He seemed scared, and I didn't blame him. But what happened next was even more unsettling. I could hear him whispering to himself from the other side of the room, but when I asked him what was wrong, he just mumbled that he didn't feel right. It was like something was in the room with us, pressing on the air, making it hard to breathe. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. I wanted to get out of that room. The next morning, I went to the kitchen and found my mom, who had been upstairs. She looked at me in surprise when she saw the Ouija board. "What is this?" she asked. I told her we'd found it in the garage. Her face went pale, and she became angry. Apparently, she'd used the board with her siblings when they were kids, and they had an experience that left them terrified. She made us promise never to use it again. It seemed like she knew something we didn't. My brother, still shaken from the night before, couldn't stop talking about what had happened during the session. He said he saw strange things in the house, shadows that didn't belong, lights flickering, and even the feeling that someone was standing behind him when no one was there. He couldn't explain it, but he knew something wasn't right. Later, when I was back at my grandfather's house, I began to notice strange things. I would feel watched, especially when I was in certain parts of the house, the upstairs especially, where I felt a cold, heavy presence. The bathroom and the narrow hallways seemed to be where I felt it most strongly. It was like something, or someone, was standing just behind me, waiting for me to turn around. One day, while I was home alone, I went to visit the basement, the very place where the Ouija board session had taken place. As soon as I stepped down the stairs, the air changed. It was colder, thicker somehow. I didn't see anything, but I felt a presence that I couldn't explain. I hurried back upstairs, feeling like something was right behind me. As time passed, things got stranger. The house started to feel more oppressive, and I began hearing things I couldn't explain, scratching noises in the walls, faint whispers when no one was around. I felt like I was being watched, but when I turned around, there was never anyone there. It wasn't until years later that I finally learned the full story of the house. The Ouija board we'd found had belonged to my mother's childhood friend, whose family had lived in the house before my grandfather. My mother confessed that they had used it regularly, and that something had happened, a spirit had been summoned, and it had stayed with them, haunting the house ever since. That explained the strange feelings I had experienced over the years. Looking back, I realize how naive I was. I had no idea what I was inviting into my life with that Ouija board session. I thought it was just a game, but something much darker had attached itself to us. That experience stayed with me, and though I don't know exactly what we summoned, I do know that I've never touched a Ouija board again, and I avoid places that feel off, or like they might have a lingering presence. At the end of September, and the beginning of October, new neighbors moved into the house behind us. They cut down all but one sickly-looking tree in the middle of their backyard. Around 4 to 7 healthy trees were removed. Around this time, a tree service that often delivers wood to us dropped off 2 large truckloads of firewood, which we had to cut and split to size. Thankfully, we have a wood splitter, which makes the task easier. But something strange started happening soon after the trees were cut down. I began to notice lights flashing in our backyard. At first, I stared at them for a while, trying to figure out what they were. After a moment, I realized they were fireflies, strange, considering the cold weather was already setting in. I had never seen fireflies this late in the season. Earlier in the summer, my husband and son had been joking about the animals that tend to show up in our yard. I made a comment saying, "Watch, we'll get an opossum this year." A couple of nights later, we had some really strong winds, and since we now smoke outside, we could hear branches snapping in the wind. My puppy, Loki, was sniffing at something by the back fence, and he kept jumping back. I knew it had to be some kind of animal, so I told him to leave it alone. But Loki kept sniffing it and jumping back again. I ran inside to get my shoes and a flashlight. When I came back outside, I discovered that a baby opossum had been blown out of the tree by the wind. The crazy part was, after I looked away from the baby opossum for just a few seconds, it disappeared. Our new back fence had no holes, and we couldn't see any way for it to get out. I checked the back fence line, and the only possible way it could have gotten out was at the corner of the fence. But we would have seen it if it had climbed it. It was as if the opossum just vanished. Later, on a still night, we heard a loud thud, like something huge had rammed the back fence, trying to get into our yard. Thankfully, we had been doing shielding around our property, so I felt a little better, but it still unnerved me. Afterward, we started hearing small branches snapping in our trees at night, as if something was moving through them. Several times, something would fly out of the tree, and once it was thrown halfway across our yard, about 110 feet by 197 feet. I spoke out loud, half joking, saying, "We weren't the ones cutting down the trees, please leave." The moment I said that, we heard more branches snapping a few houses down the street. Around the same time, the local power company began trimming trees around our neighborhood, but they didn't seem to care how butchered the trees looked. The snapping and breaking of branches continued, and again I said, "We didn't do it, please go away." Once again, we heard the sound of branches snapping several houses away. One night, my son and I heard loud munching coming from the tree closest to our house. To calm myself, I joked with him about it being a raccoon, but when we checked, it didn't sound like any animal we'd ever heard before. We had seen the baby opossum a couple of times, but it had grown much larger than I remembered. The opossum seemed scared and curled up in the corner of the yard before disappearing again. At this point, I was really starting to wonder what was going on. I don't know what was snapping those branches. The branches that were snapping were at least 1.5 to 2 inches thick, or possibly even bigger. It wasn't squirrels or the small opossum. Whatever it was much bigger. There was only one night where I saw evidence of something being eaten. To be honest, I'm starting to think it could have been a pissed-off nature spirit. The way the branches were snapping and the odd energy around it, it just didn't feel like a normal animal. It happened both during the day and night, which ruled out squirrels or other small creatures. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. I've lived in many different homes throughout my life, some quiet and uneventful, and others with strange happenings. The first house I want to talk about is the one my family moved to in upstate New York when I was 9 years old. People often think of New York City when I mention that I've lived in New York, but the state itself is mostly rural, full of farmland, rolling hills, and forests. Over the years, I've lived in 3 homes in the state, all out in the country. The first was on a farm, the second was nestled between 2 dairy farms, and the last one was right next to the Allegheny Forest. In all 3 places, we had Amish neighbors, which gives you a good sense of how remote and rural the area was. Our first house was a huge, 3-story farmhouse, built in the 1940s. It had a big attic, but the real interesting part was the basement. In the corner of the kitchen, there was a door leading down to it. At the bottom of the stairs, to the right, was a large meat room. This part of the basement always freaked me out, and I hated having to pass by it. I preferred to use any other entrance to the basement if I could. The meat room was different from the rest of the basement. It looked like it had been dug out separately and was built with different materials. The walls were made from a different kind of mortar, and it always felt colder in that room, even in the summer. My dad used it to cut and cure meat since we raised cows, pigs, and chickens on the farm. There was also a bricked-up door on one of the walls that seemed to have been sealed off. My mom thought it might have been part of an old underground railroad, especially since she found out that some homes in the area were used to help slaves escape during the 19th century. The house's previous owners had told us that the original home had burned down and was rebuilt in the 1940s, so that sealed-off door could have been part of something much older. One weekend, my aunt and uncle came to visit from Boston, and my parents decided to show them around the area. My brother and I stayed behind. He was 13 at the time, and he offered to babysit me while they were out. We were upstairs playing in our rooms, and the bathroom on the top floor had a large laundry chute that led down to the basement. My brother had the idea of using a rope to climb down the chute, and as we were setting up, we started hearing voices coming from the basement. It sounded like a group of people, men and women, talking, but the voices weren't familiar, and we couldn't understand what they were saying. We thought it might be our parents, so we decided to sneak down to the basement and scare them. But when we got downstairs, the basement was empty. Everything was locked up just like they had left it. We ran back up the stairs and locked ourselves in my brother's room. When our parents returned, we asked if they had come home earlier, and they said they hadn't. There was no TV or radio on in the house, so we couldn't explain where the voices came from. This was the first time we heard strange voices in the house. About a year later, my brother moved his bedroom downstairs into what used to be the study. One day, while my parents and I were out at the grocery store, I got a strange phone call. My brother was on the other end. He was panicked and asked me to stay on the phone with him because he was scared. He told me that while he was lying on his bed resting, he heard a voice in his head telling him to go to the gun cabinet, take out a shotgun, and hurt himself. He said he felt like something was pulling him toward the cabinet. I told him to stay calm and not listen to the voice. Even though I was only 10, I could sense that something wasn't right. I stayed on the phone with him until my parents got back, and everything was fine once we were home. But that wasn't the end of it. One night, my brother asked me to sleep in his room with him. We were lying in bed when he woke me up and asked if I could hear anything. At first, I didn't hear anything, but then I listened carefully and realized I could hear voices coming from the basement again. This time, it sounded like 2 or 3 people talking, but we couldn't make out what they were saying, even though it sounded like English. After about 10 minutes, the voices stopped, and we decided to leave the room. My brother moved back upstairs shortly after that. There were other strange things happening in the house, too. Sometimes, we'd hear tapping sounds coming from the second-floor windows, and one day while I was sitting in the living room cutting out paper dolls, something slammed against the coffee table 3 times so hard that it shook. My mom heard it too, and we both jumped up, calling for my dad. Then, there was one particularly creepy incident. Winters in upstate New York can be brutal, with temperatures dropping well below freezing. One morning, my mom decided to go out and get the mail. It was freezing, so she bundled up in her heavy house coat and winter boots. She left the kitchen door slightly open as she stepped out onto the porch. When she returned, she heard the door slammed shut behind her. She rushed back to open it, but it was locked tight. The door was securely shut, which scared her because she had purposely left it unlocked and ajar. She had to walk to our neighbor's house about an eighth of a mile away to get help. She was nearly frozen by the time she reached their door. My mom called my dad, and when they came back to the house, the door was exactly as she had left it. She insisted she hadn't imagined it, and said there was no draft or wind that could have caused the door to slam like that. She'd made sure the door was unlocked, and there was no logical explanation for what had happened. One night, my good friend, now my best friend of 8 years, and I decided to take a walk to another friend's house to pick something up. We left my house around 2 a.m. It was extremely quiet and dark outside, almost too quiet. There were no streetlights, and we were surrounded by woods. The nearest house was about 200 to 300 feet up a hill. As we walked down the hill, we were side by side in the middle of the road when, out of nowhere, I saw a group of small, glowing, white figures, about 10 to 20 of them. They looked identical to one another, but I couldn't make out any faces. They reminded me of the simple man symbol you'd see on a bathroom sign. There were 2 or 3 rows of them, almost like they were marching alongside us, moving in front and around us. They didn't make any noise, and none of them looked at us or interacted with us in any way. They just walked with us, keeping their position steady, almost as if they were moving in sync with us. I didn't feel fear at first, just confusion. I turned to my friend and asked, "Hey, do you see anything?" Before I could finish, he cut me off and said, "Yeah, like little children." That's when I realized we were both seeing the same thing. At that point, we started to freak out. The experience only lasted a few minutes, but strangely, when we got home, we realized we had been gone for over an hour, and we were only half a mile from my house. I don't remember the figures fading away or anything dramatic like that. They just vanished suddenly, all at once. My friend and I ran to get back to the house, but we bumped into each other, and I dropped my iPhone. It felt even creepier without the small light from the phone. When I picked it up and turned the screen back on, the atmosphere around us felt a little less intense. We kept walking back, thinking the weirdness was over, but I still kept my phone in my hand with the light on. Out of nowhere, a much taller, shadowy figure appeared in front of me. It grew to about 7 feet tall and was black, almost like a shadow. I stopped dead in my tracks because I didn't want to walk through it. I kept moving, and not even 30 seconds later, another black figure appeared further down the road, blocking my path again. I stopped again, and this time, I could feel my heart racing. We continued walking toward the house, and after that, I didn't see any more strange figures. We passed a few houses, but nothing else happened. I don't think my friend saw the shadowy figures. I think it was just me. When we finally made it home, it was around 5 a.m., and the whole experience started around 3 a.m. The time didn't add up though. It was such a short walk, but we couldn't figure out how we had lost so much time. My friend had a seizure about 10 minutes after we got into the house. I ran to get my mom and stepdad, and we helped him through it. He was okay after a while, and was picked up around 6 a.m. to rest at home. The next morning, I told my mom and stepdad about everything that had happened. My stepdad mentioned that he and his son thought they saw a UFO fly over our house earlier that night. At that point, I was even more confused. What did we encounter that night? We don't know. It could have been paranormal, or maybe we were dealing with something extraterrestrial. We just can't fully explain it. It feels like something out of a dream when I think back on it. I'm still curious about what we experienced. Personally, I believe in spirits and energy, and I think that's more likely what we encountered. But who knows? Whatever it was certainly interesting, and it's something I'll never forget. On January 23, my mother-in-law was involved in a serious accident. A 91-year-old woman in a Lexus SUV had a stop sign but was almost already in the middle of my mother-in-law's lane. She backed up, and my mother-in-law assumed she would stay there, so she continued driving. Personally, I would have kept my foot on the brake in case the woman suddenly pulled out, and that's exactly what happened. The woman did pull out, and I'm not entirely sure who hit who, but their bumpers locked, and the woman ended up pushing my mother-in-law completely across the road she was driving on. A quick exam at the ER showed that my mother-in-law had a fractured rib and some soft tissue injuries, but she was sent home. By 2 days later, she was bruised terribly. At the same time, I had been checking on my dog, Kaya, who was heavily pregnant and almost due. By Thursday, Kaya looked terrible. She wasn't eating and had very low energy. I had heard that she was expecting 6 or possibly 7 puppies, which added to my concern. I hadn't visited my mother-in-law in person because she kept assuring me that she was sore but fine, and my daughter had been checking on her regularly. My daughter would even bring my mother-in-law over to our house just to get her out of hers. Thursday night, I could tell something was off, but I brushed it off as nerves about Kaya. I went to bed later than usual, but still earlier than usual for me. At 5 a.m., my dogs woke me up, which was unusual, so I knew something was wrong. I let them out, but they wouldn't calm down. I saw my father-in-law briefly, and he looked worried, so I knew sleep was out of the question. At 5:30 a.m., my mother-in-law called, telling me she was in terrible stomach pain and having trouble breathing. I told her I'd get dressed and be there as soon as possible. Then, 20 minutes later, she called again, asking where I was. I was almost out the door, and I told my daughter to stay home because I didn't want her to add to the drama. When I arrived at my mother-in-law's house, she told me she had been feeling this way all night. I immediately told her I was calling paramedics because there was no way I could move her. At the hospital, my mother-in-law told the doctors she had been sick all night. The doctor asked why she didn't come in earlier, and she responded, "I didn't want to bother you." I couldn't help but point out that she had no problem calling me at 5:30 a.m. They ended up performing surgery on Friday night to remove severely damaged large intestines, likely caused by the seatbelt. She's doing fine now, but they are keeping an eye on a large hematoma. Saturday morning, I woke up to Kaya, who was obviously uncomfortable. I knew the big day had come. She was howling, whining, just everything that signaled it was time. I had been joking with my sons, quoting that line from Gone with the Wind. "I don't know nothing about birthing no babies." My sons went to work, but I told my youngest son that Kaya would start giving birth around 2 p.m. My husband and daughter were at the hospital visiting my mother-in-law, and I needed help. I called out for my father-in-law, and I heard him say, "I'm here. Take her in your room and quiet her down." So I brought Kaya into my room and just sat there, stroking and massaging her. When the contractions got really strong, my grandfather stayed nearby, offering guidance if I needed it. The first pup arrived at 2:03 p.m. Kaya yelped but quickly began cleaning it. By 2:18, 4 puppies had been born. One came out still covered by the sack, and I heard my grandfather's voice telling me to break the sack. By then, my husband and daughter had returned, and I really needed a break. My husband went into the room, and within 5 minutes, he yelled that the 5th puppy was born. My daughter, who had been observing, stepped in and helped catch the rest of the puppies. I stepped back into the room and found one of the puppies lying motionless. I rubbed it vigorously and let Kaya lick it while I cleared its mouth. Miraculously, it came to life. By the end of the day, Kaya had given birth to 11 puppies, 7 males and 4 females, far more than we expected. This happened about 15 years ago, and to this day, it still puzzles me and the 2 friends who witnessed it with me. It was either my 10th or 11th birthday, late August, just as summer was winding down. I lived in a quiet suburban development just outside of Buffalo, New York. My 2 friends and I were outside on my driveway, playing around while our parents hung out inside. Now, before I tell you what happened, If anyone reading this has any idea of what we saw, please get in touch because, to this day, I have no clue what, or who, we encountered that night. So, as I said, it was either my 10th or 11th birthday, late at night, and we were out on the driveway. My house is next to another one that has a small creek with a guardrail bridge, almost directly across from us. We were just hanging out when, all of a sudden, all three of us stopped what we were doing. We heard someone making loud, frustrated sounds, almost like stomping their feet, walking across the street from the creek and bridge. We saw her, this woman. She had red, curly hair and was dressed in a way that seemed completely out of place. She wore a black robe with a rope around the waist, and the robe looked plaid, but not like anything I'd ever seen before. Even though it was the late 90s, when dressing in a gothic style was popular, this woman's clothes didn't resemble anything I'd seen on anyone back then, either. It was so odd that it freaked us out, so we ran into my garage, trying to figure out what was going on. Not even 10 seconds passed before we decided it was probably just a girl, and we didn't need to be scared. So, we mustered up some courage, grabbed a hockey stick for protection, and ventured back outside. We stayed in the corner of my garage, peering out to where we had seen her stomping around across the street. But when we looked, she was gone. In her place was a light fog, almost like it had appeared out of nowhere, especially around the area where we had last seen her and the bridge. Then, all at once, we felt it, an overwhelming sense of dread in the pit of our stomachs. We didn't even have to see her to know where she was. When we looked again, she was standing on the bridge, now fully cloaked in the fog, staring down into the water. One of us whispered something, and I swear, I felt like she heard it. Slowly, she lifted her head and turned to look right at us. Her eyes weren't visible, and she looked less like a person and more like a shadowy figure. That's when we knew we had to get out of there. It felt like something straight out of a horror movie. We ran as fast as we could into my house, slamming the garage door shut behind us. We tried to tell our parents, but, of course, they didn't believe us. Since that night, a lot of weird things have happened, things I can't quite explain. And honestly, the three of us have never been the same since then. If anyone has any idea of what that might have been, please reach out. I've avoided knowing for years, but now, I can't avoid it any longer. My mom passed away last year after a long battle with illness. In the end, she told us she'd had enough and that her quality of life had deteriorated to a point where it wasn't worth continuing. Though heartbroken, the entire family respected her decision. She decided to stop taking the medications that had been keeping her alive. Remarkably, after stopping the medications, she rallied for about 4 days. During this time, she was able to say her goodbyes and we were able to let go slowly. We even had one final supper together as a family, a beautiful event full of emotion, love, and connection. I was very close to my mom, and we often had deep conversations about many things, including the afterlife and the paranormal. A day or two before she passed, I asked her to reach out to me from the other side, if possible, to let me know she was okay. The day after our last supper, she passed quietly, surrounded by our love. It was the best possible way we could have hoped for her to go. Her wake was held at an old funeral home in a small town in upstate New York. We gathered in a large room to receive visitors, as friends and family came to pay their respects. Near the end of the wake, I stepped out into the hallway to check on my 92-year-old father, who was in the bathroom. After making sure he was okay, I turned to head back down the hall. As I walked back, I noticed something unusual. At the corner of the hallway, near a closet, I saw a large moving shadow. It seemed to be moving quickly from left to right, heading toward the closet. The shadow was tall, with broad shoulders, and the moment I noticed it, it seemed to freeze, then quickly dart toward the closet as though trying to hide. I didn't feel fear, just an overwhelming sense of curiosity. I stood still for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. As I approached the shadow, something incredible happened. Suddenly, a sort of window appeared, floor to ceiling, with clear square edges. Within this window, A swirling smoky image seemed to shift and move, though its shape was indiscernible. The window was illuminated from within by a bright light, and the smoky image kept swirling, filling the entire space. Then, out of nowhere, a bright track of light shot out from the window, crossing the floor at a perfect 45-degree angle toward the open closet. The light stopped just short of the closet door. Almost immediately, another window appeared from the bright light, now filling the space from floor to ceiling. This new window was also square-edged and illuminated from within, about half an inch thick. As I watched in astonishment, the smoky image from the first window began to swirl into the second window, while the first window disappeared completely. I moved closer, trying to take in every detail, when something even stranger happened. Along the edges of the new window, a white vapor began to appear, almost like steam. It swirled outward from the edges at a distinct 90-degree angle, moving toward the closet. In that moment, a thought crossed my mind. Am I hallucinating? Am I losing my mind? As if to confirm that this was real, the vapor continued to move into the closet. Then, just as suddenly, the window and the track of light disappeared. The last bit of vapor brushed against a jacket hanging by itself in the closet. Almost immediately, the jacket started swinging gently on its hanger. I moved closer to the closet, my heart pounding. I looked inside, but there was nothing there. The jacket was still swinging back and forth, all on its own. The house I grew up in has always been active. From the moment my family moved in, strange things began happening. My father started renovating right away, which we suspect might have stirred up the spirits, but for some reason, my mother named our resident ghost George. We always felt there were multiple spirits in the house. Over the years, we've heard different voices, an older man, a child, and a woman, but we always blamed George even though we thought there might be more than one presence. This particular experience happened when I was about 13. At the time, we had a toy poodle named Curly. Curly was a pain in the butt, a dog who refused to potty train or learn basic commands. Anyway, when it was time for him to have a bath, we'd do it in the basement in a large laundry sink. Since I was the oldest, my brothers were 6 and 3 years younger than me. I usually got stuck with the job of giving Curly his bath. I hated going down to the basement alone. It always felt like someone was watching you, and you never felt truly alone. I tried to get out of it, making excuses to avoid the task. Eventually, my mother threatened to ground me if I didn't get it done, so I grabbed the shampoo, towel, and Curly and headed downstairs. While I was giving Curly his bath, I could hear my parents chatting and laughing upstairs in the living room. Just as I finished, I heard my mother start the vacuum. Then, out of nowhere, the lights in the basement went out. I was plunged into total darkness, so dark I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face. I was absolutely terrified. I froze, hoping it was just a mistake and the lights would come back on. After a few minutes, I started yelling, "Turn the lights back on!" over and over, but of course, my parents didn't hear me because of the vacuum. I couldn't move. I just kept yelling and crying. Finally, the vacuum stopped, and I heard my mother yell from upstairs. "What?" I shouted at her to turn the lights on. I heard her walk over to the basement door, which was off the kitchen, and then the lights flicked on. She asked, "Why did you turn them off?" I was completely confused. I grabbed Curly and ran upstairs, crying and complaining about how mean they were for playing a prank on me. But my parents laughed and said, "What? You turned the lights off?" They assumed I had pulled some kind of prank, though I was too scared to think about pranking anyone at the time. When I continued to cry and insist that I didn't do it, they finally realized I wasn't joking. Here's the strangest part. Above the light switch, there were 3 wet drip marks on the wall. They looked like someone had touched the wall with a wet hand before sliding it down to turn off the switch. Since I was giving the dog a bath, my parents initially thought it was me. After all, my hands were wet. But my brothers weren't home. They were at a family member's house, having a sleepover with cousins. When my parents realized it wasn't me, Their faces turned serious, and they fell quiet. They apologized and tried to explain it away, but my mom half-jokingly suggested that George had played a prank. The thing is, George's pranks were never funny, and to this day, they still aren't. My dad still tells that story, and it's one of the many strange occurrences we've had in that house. I was 20 when I got Scrappy. After moving out of my parents' house a year earlier, I knew I wanted a small dog. One day, my mom called me and said, "I found your dog. I already put a deposit down." That was so typical of her, taking charge. She gave me the address and said, "He looks like Toto from The Wizard of Oz. You'll know him when you see him." I drove to the house, where there were 2 silky terrier puppies left, both males. They were 6 months old, a little older than usual, but when I saw him, a little black puppy charging towards me, jumping to be picked up, I knew instantly this was him. The owner confirmed it, and I brought him home. I spent a while trying to decide on a name. He was a maniac, jumping from the couch to the floor, then back to the chair. Eventually, I thought of Scrappy, after Scooby-Doo's fearless, independent sidekick, and it fit him perfectly. After his first grooming, his coat transformed into a mix of black, brown, and silver. I didn't even recognize him when I went to pick him up. He looked so different, but of course, it was my little Spaz. To keep things short, I'll summarize. About 4 months after I got Scrappy, I found out I was pregnant with my daughter. I was finishing college and working part-time. At 6 months, I went into premature labor and was put on bed rest. Thankfully, my daughter stayed put and was born healthy. A year and 3 months later, my mother passed away suddenly. About a year after that, my fiancé and I split up. I moved back in with my dad and, a year and a half later, moved in with my boyfriend. We had custody of his daughter from a previous relationship, so I went from 1 child to 3 almost overnight. Unfortunately, our relationship didn't last, and I moved into my own apartment with my kids and Scrappy. A few years later, I met my current boyfriend, and after living in a small apartment for some time, we moved into a house about 6 years ago. Leading up to the move, I noticed Scrappy acting lethargic. A trip to the vet confirmed he had cancer. It was devastating. He lasted 2 more months in our new home, and I had to make the heart-wrenching decision to say goodbye. I mourned Scrappy deeply. He was my first dog out on my own, my first baby, and my faithful companion through all the big moments. My mom's death, the birth of my children, relationships, multiple moves. He was there for everything. I couldn't believe how much it hurt to lose him. A month after his passing, I was in bed watching TV with my boyfriend. I turned to comment on the show when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a small dark silhouette in the hallway. It was the exact shape and height of Scrappy. I gasped and said, "Oh my God! I just saw Scrappy!" But my boyfriend didn't see anything. A few weeks later, the same thing happened, except this time, I heard a "mark" sound from the end of the bed, Scrappy's lazy bark that often sounded like a muffled "Marth." I sat up, called his name softly, but when I checked the room, nothing was there. I thanked him for visiting. 2 months later, something even stranger happened. Everyone was asleep, and I was trying to get comfortable in bed when I felt something light and slow walking up the bed between me and my boyfriend. It felt exactly like a small dog walking across the bed, like Scrappy used to do. At first I froze, confused, but then I realized this was Scrappy. I thought he was coming for a cuddle. It happened 2 more times, and each time I could feel the energy, loving and playful. The walking always stopped around my waist, just as Scrappy used to do when he hopped into bed, checked on us, then hopped out. My boyfriend never experienced it, but he believes it was Scrappy too. At the time, we didn't have any pets, and there were no animals in the house. Scrappy was gone, but I still wonder if he checks in sometimes. My new dog occasionally watches something, her head cocked to the side, following something at just the right height for a small dog. I like to think it's Scrappy, still making his rounds. Maybe one day, I'll get another cuddle. I was reminded of this experience recently when talking to my brother about our grandparents' house. Technically, they're my step-grandparents, but I think many of you can agree that blood isn't always thicker than water. My grandmother was a tough, fiery Italian woman, standing at just 4 feet 9 inches, with a personality bigger than life. My grandfather passed away when I was 15. He had a great sense of humor and was always telling jokes. When I was about 10 or 11, my grandparents lived in a duplex they owned. For those who aren't familiar, a duplex looks like a single home from the outside, but it's divided inside by 2 entryways and a wall separating the 2 residences. My grandparents' duplex was 2 stories with a shared basement. My uncle and aunt lived in the other half, so it always felt like one big home. My dad, who I rarely call my stepdad, because he's truly my dad, has told me many strange stories about growing up in that house. At first, I thought he was just telling me stories, but over time, I asked my grandmother about the house, and she confirmed some of the odd things my dad had said. First, I want to share a few of the stories my dad and grandmother have told me, and then I'll share my own experience, which may or may not be connected. I'm not sure. My dad and his siblings often heard what sounded like ghostly footsteps going up the stairs at night, and disembodied voices would sometimes echo through the house. There were a couple of incidents that stood out. When my uncle was about 5 or 6 years old, he saw what he described as a ball of fire enter the house through the living room wall. Inside the fireball was a man's face, which he described as a very scary man, with intense eyes. The ball of fire floated around the living room for a few seconds before zipping into the kitchen and passing through the wall. The kitchen wall led to the backyard. My dad, uncle, and grandmother all recalled the same details of this event, though my uncle, who was the only one to actually see it, ran screaming to his mom. Another incident happened when my grandparents, dad, and uncle were sitting in the living room after dinner. They were just relaxing and watching TV when they suddenly heard the sound of dishes clattering in the kitchen. My grandmother and father, who were sitting near the kitchen door, looked into the kitchen just as a set of cupboard doors flew open. Plates and dishes hovered in the air for a few seconds before dropping to the floor, smashing most of them. My uncle and grandfather only heard the clattering and smashing, but my grandmother and father saw the whole thing unfold. My dad and grandmother gave the same exact details, and my uncle confirmed hearing the noise and seeing the mess afterward. It's a crazy story, but when I asked my grandmother about it years later, she confirmed it without hesitation. She's 85 now, sharp as ever, still doing her housework and chatting while chain-smoking, and she doesn't tell stories. Now, for my own experience. It wasn't as dramatic as some of the other incidents, but it's something that has puzzled me for nearly 30 years. I was about 10 or 11, and my family, my mom, dad, 2 brothers, and I, were visiting my grandparents. It wasn't a special occasion, just a regular weekend visit since we lived about 45 minutes away. Their house was small. There was a rectangular kitchen with a doorway leading into the living room, and the bathroom and 2 bedrooms were upstairs. I decided to go upstairs to use the bathroom, and afterward, I decided to snoop around my grandparents' bedroom. It was always impeccably clean and organized, and I liked looking at their knickknacks or sometimes playing with my grandmother's combs and brushes on her dresser. For some reason, I decided to slide under their bed. Unlike my own bed, theirs was clean underneath, and there was no dust ruffle to block my view. I laid on my stomach, facing the doorway, when something strange happened. Suddenly, I went completely blind. I remember blinking rapidly, trying to figure out what was going on. I flailed around a bit, then cried out for my mom, but she couldn't hear me. As I started to inch my way out from under the bed, the blindness suddenly disappeared, and my vision returned. I panicked and ran downstairs, but I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't understand what had just happened, and I didn't want to admit that I had been snooping, so I kept it to myself. I never went back into their bedroom after that. What baffles me to this day is that it happened in the middle of the day, with sunlight streaming through the windows. One moment I could see perfectly, and the next, complete blackness. The temporary blindness lasted maybe 10 to 15 seconds, but I've never experienced anything like that again. I don't know if this event is connected to the paranormal experiences my family had, but after hearing all of their stories, I can't help but wonder. I still think about it, and sometimes it's hard to shake the feeling that there was something more going on in that house. First, I want to give a big thank you to Miracles for the support and encouragement in sharing this experience. This isn't your typical ghost story, but I hope you'll find it interesting regardless. A little background: I started astral projecting almost 5 years ago, and the first time it happened was completely spontaneous, as were the following 2 or 3 times. It was mind-blowing. I remember thinking, "Oh my God, it's real! This is amazing!" I didn't feel fear at all. I just knew what was happening as it happened. Before that, I had always thought out-of-body experiences were myths, or at least exaggerated stories. I'm so glad I was wrong. Since then, I've gotten a little better at controlling and initiating my astral projections, but I'm still far from an expert. Most of my experiences have been short, and sometimes hazy, especially when it comes to vision. But I've had a few beautiful, very clear, and deeply personal experiences that have solidified my belief in the existence of life after death. This particular experience happened in 2016, 2 years ago. I had intentionally gone out of body, and almost immediately, I found myself in what I would describe as a warehouse, just a large, nondescript space. I walked down a hallway to explore, turned a corner, and saw my mother standing there. My mother passed away almost 17 years ago, in November, and I've had a few encounters with her while out of body. Our interactions are usually brief, with lots of hugs and her reassuring me that she's with me and loves me. I feel very lucky in that regard. This time, as soon as I saw her, I immediately asked, "Is the voice I heard earlier, the one that sounded like grumbling, was that George?" George is the name we gave the spirit or ghost in the house I grew up in. I've mentioned him in previous stories. I don't know why I asked that, but I did. My mother made this sound, like a thoughtful "em," as if she was debating on whether or not to tell me. I asked again, and she responded, "Listen, pay attention. You need to remember 5010. I was confused and asked, "What does that mean?" She replied, "Just remember 5010. Pay attention. Something will happen next week, and you'll know what it means." Then, just like that, I was back in my body, awake and trying to make sense of what had just happened. The numbers 5010 kept nagging at me, so I called my dad to explain everything. He believes me about the astral projection experiences, but he has a hard time fully understanding them, and I don't blame him. He wondered if it had to do with the date May 10th, 50 equals May, the 5th month, after you subtract the 0, and 10 equals the 10th day. I understood why he thought that, but I couldn't explain why it had been presented that way. This conversation took place on May 5th or 6th, so I wondered if the message was indeed related to May 10th, but it just seemed too simple, too easy. So I put it out of my mind and thought, when the time comes, I'll know what 5010 means. Fast forward a few days. My cousin, who I'm very close to, we're only 4 months apart, called me in hysterics. She was sobbing, trying to speak, but finally I understood her. She was saying, "He's gone! He's gone! My brother is gone! He's dead!" For privacy, I'll call him Ray. My cousin was devastated. Ray was only 31 years old, and his death was sudden and completely unexpected. I was in shock. I immediately jumped in the car to go to her house to be with her. On the drive over, it hit me, the date was May 10th. I called my dad to deliver the news and to start gathering the family. Then I told him, "Dad, it's May 10th. He immediately responded, "Oh my God! It is! It was true!" I still can't fully process how my mother gave me that piece of information, something so serious. I'll never forget the moment I realized what had just happened. There was one more thing I want to mention. Just before my cousin's phone call, my left ear started ringing, very loud and high-pitched. It was so intense that I stopped what I was doing. I felt uneasy, but I didn't know why. I can't say for sure if the ringing was connected, but I thought it was worth mentioning. The only thing I can think of is that my mother somehow gave me a heads up about Ray's death. I know it sounds crazy, but this is what I believe. Our family on the other side was ready for him, and maybe it was just his time. We weren't meant to intervene, but we were meant to understand that he was being welcomed home. This thought has brought me comfort ever since, and it gave me the strength to help with the arrangements and support Ray's siblings and father. Ray's mother, my mother's sister, had also passed away about 6 years earlier. The incident I'm about to share happened about 5 years ago, when my son, I'll call him Peter to protect his privacy, was around 9 or 10 years old. It wasn't a scary experience, but in my opinion, it was an amazing one, and it's something that will always be dear to my heart. A little background first. Peter had a few experiences involving figures in his room when he was about 9. From the way he described them, it seemed like he was seeing shadow figures. These figures didn't interact with him. He would simply notice them in the corners of his room or standing across the room from his bed. Over the course of a year, he saw these figures maybe 4 or 5 times. Sometimes he came to me at night, and sometimes he told me in the morning. I've always been open with my children about spirits, deceased loved ones, and paranormal happenings. However, I always try to rule out non-paranormal explanations first if I can. There's no need to scare ourselves if the shadow figure is just a coat hanging on a peg or a toy that looks like a person in the dark. So, naturally, I investigated Peter's room during the day and night to see if there was anything that could be causing these figures. Based on his descriptions, where the figure was, its height, whether it moved, and how he felt, I could never find anything. His room didn't feel eerie or heavy, and I didn't pick up on anything unusual when I went in there. Peter never felt afraid, just uneasy when the figures appeared. So, I talked to him about imagining a white protective light around him and his room. I also encouraged him to communicate with his spirit guides, asking for their protection. I did the same on my end, speaking aloud in his room and politely asking whatever might be there to not scare my son. I also spoke about moving on to the light, just in case there was anything lingering that needed guidance. Afterward, Peter told me he felt much better, and he didn't report seeing any figures for quite a while. Then, about a year later, something happened that intrigued me deeply. One morning, Peter shared an experience that I've thought about often since then. He told me that the night before, he hadn't fallen asleep yet. He was lying on his side, thinking about a game he wanted, when he turned over to face his room. That's when he saw a figure standing across the room from him. He described it as a boy, about his height, and said the boy was all white light. He could make out the outline of the boy's head, arms, legs, and torso, but there were no other features, no facial details or clothing. Peter also noticed that the boy had a bow and arrow on his back. He explained that the bow was sideways, almost horizontal, so the ends of the bow were visible, but the middle part was obscured by the boy's body. What struck me most was that Peter said the boy seemed to be playing some sort of game. The boy kept appearing close to Peter, then quickly moving across the room to the other side, as if he were being playful. This near-far game went on a few times before the boy disappeared completely. Peter wasn't frightened, but he said he was confused by what he saw. I was floored when I heard this. I couldn't think of any way to explain it away or figure out what it could have been. I thought about it for a while, and finally told my son that it seemed like he had been visited by his guardian angel or perhaps a spirit guide. The boy never appeared again, but Peter has never forgotten the details, and neither have I. Peter is adamant that he wasn't dreaming or asleep when it happened. After the appearance of the boy made of light, Peter never experienced any more shadow figures or light figures. I truly believe that he had a special visit that night, and I've always told him how lucky he is to have seen his guardian angel or guide. The myths surrounding the Galloway Lady in the Glass Case Memorial in Lakeview Cemetery in Jamestown, New York, have grown with each passing generation. Over time, the story has evolved, with speculations ranging from the tragic death of a young bride to a forbidden love between a wealthy heiress and her chauffeur. Some claim she still roams the cemetery on foggy, moonlit nights, crying for her lost love, while others believe her body is encased within the statue itself. But the real story behind the memorial is both beautiful and poignant. Grace Laverne Galloway was the only daughter of 3 children born to a wealthy family. Her father, John Galloway, had made his fortune in oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania. They lived in a grand mansion, which later became the Moose Club in Jamestown. Grace was a promising opera singer who frequently performed at the Chautauqua Institution. Because of her musical talent, her family sent her to a music school in Boston to further her studies. At the time, Grace was a young woman focused on her career and had little interest in romance. Although Grace was friendly, outgoing, and generous with her time, there is no evidence to suggest she was ever seriously involved with anyone before her untimely death at 26. Grace died in 1898 from tuberculosis, contracted during her time in Boston. Her parents, desperate to save her, had sent her to North Carolina in hopes that the warmer climate would help, but she passed away a year later in Pittsburgh on her way home. All the Galloway wealth could not save their only daughter. To honor Grace, her family commissioned a statue of her, designed to serve as a living memorial. The statue was carved in Florence, Italy, from Italian marble, modeled after Grace's last portrait. Her dress was sent along with the statue to ensure it was replicated as closely as possible. The statue was originally left uncovered, but over time, the elements began to take their toll. To preserve it, the statue was eventually encased in glass. The life-size glass-enclosed statue of Grace in Lakeview Cemetery continues to attract thousands of visitors each year, and countless stories, many of them exaggerated, circulate about the lady in the glass case. Some say the young woman in the statue still haunts the cemetery, though these tales are mostly unsubstantiated. One such tale, however, is especially close to my heart and occurred when I was an active member of the Moose Lodge in Jamestown in 1985. On Thursday evenings, I would meet my brother and friends at the lodge to play cards. Most of the time, we played in the dining room on the first floor, but on nights when there were fewer of us, we'd head down to the basement. One evening, I arrived and went straight to the dining room to meet my friends, only to find they had moved downstairs. I had left my jacket draped over a chair in the dining room, so I decided to grab it later. There was a back stairway from the dining room that led down to the basement. After a few hours of playing cards, around 1 a.m., everyone started to leave. I remembered my jacket and went back upstairs to retrieve it. As I walked back down the stairs and reached the landing, I came face to face with Grace. She stood there, about 2 feet away from me, completely still. I froze, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. She looked startled, and so did I. Grace was slightly shorter than me, partly transparent, glowing in a soft white light. She didn't speak, but I had the distinct feeling she was somehow inviting me to follow her. The air around us grew dry and cold, and I stood there for what felt like 30 seconds, unsure of what to do. Finally, I gathered my thoughts and quickly walked back to the main entrance to meet my friends outside. I was horrified, but I knew exactly what had just happened. When I told my friends about the encounter, they could tell from my face that I was shaken. "I just saw Grace," I said, and explained what I had experienced. To this day, I've never forgotten that moment. In the spring of 2019, the building where I had this encounter was scheduled to be demolished. But Grace's memory, her story, and the mystery of her glass-enclosed statue live on, continuing to captivate and intrigue all those who visit her resting place at Lakeview Cemetery. In 2016, when I was 16, I was hospitalized due to overworking myself in school. I was in an AP US history class where we were competing with other specialized high schools in New York City, and I was juggling many extracurriculars, treasurer of the National Honor Society, member of the yearbook committee, head of a student-run monthly talent show, and secretary of the student government. I was a junior in high school, working hard to apply to colleges that would help me pursue a pre-med track. I pushed myself beyond my limits, and eventually, I became severely depressed and burned out. As a result, I was hospitalized in a psychiatric facility, which was not an asylum. It wasn't a typical hospital experience. You had school in the hospital, group therapy sessions, meetings with doctors, pet therapy, and peer discussions. After 2 weeks, I was discharged and sent to a partial hospitalization program where I continued a similar routine, but I was able to go home at the end of the day. I've struggled with major depressive disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder for years, which typically resulted in anxiety and frequent crying episodes. But I had always been a very level-headed person, so the severity of this burnout was overwhelming. When I got to the partial program, I told the doctors that I couldn't stop having nightmares and that I had too much anxiety to sleep. They prescribed several sleeping medications, but none of them worked. Eventually, they tried a medication called Ambien. Ambience's side effects list includes hallucinations, and that's exactly what happened to me. I remember seeing my parents appear as if they were zooming in and out. One moment they were right in front of me, the next they seemed far away. At the time, my mother and grandfather were trying to get me to drink water, hoping it would help flush the medication out of my system. The lights were on, and the TV was playing in the background, but then I started seeing things I'll never forget. I saw figures, shadow people, or shadow children, I guess. They weren't scary, but they were very strange. Their eyes glowed in blue and yellow, and one was waving at me while the other seemed to offer me something. Maybe books, though I could be mistaken. I remember there were 2 of them, sitting on top of my furniture, almost touching the ceiling. They were like 2-dimensional beings, either threatening nor malicious, but more curious or friendly. Their eyes were the size of baseballs, and their heads seemed small, perhaps because of the size of their eyes. Even though I knew I was hallucinating due to the medication, I didn't feel afraid. But when I shared this experience with others, they seemed disturbed by it, which made me wonder if they would have felt differently had they been in my shoes. I later researched shadow people, and found out that the term I thought I had coined for these beings already existed. There were websites and forums filled with people sharing their own encounters with shadow figures, and many seemed to describe experiences similar to mine. Even though I know these were hallucinations brought on by the drug, I don't think the shadow people were evil. I'm still unsure if they were spirits, beings from another dimension, or something else entirely. Whatever they were, they didn't harm me, and they didn't feel malevolent. To this day, I still think about them and wonder what they really were. It was just a normal Monday evening when I met up with my friend, like we usually did. But instead of staying inside to play video games, we decided to go explore an old abandoned building near one of our houses. We had been there before, so we were familiar with the layout and knew our way around pretty well. We sneaked in through a broken window that had once been covered by a piece of plywood. There was just enough light filtering in from the outside to help us navigate. We had to be cautious though, as the building was sometimes surveilled by security. Once inside, we started walking around, checking out different parts of the building. It was mostly just trash and graffiti, nothing out of the ordinary. At one point, my friend said he heard a door close. I didn't hear anything, so I shrugged it off, telling him his mind was probably playing tricks on him. We stayed on the lookout for anyone else who might be around. Either of us wanted to confront someone else in the building. Eventually, we came to a stairwell leading down to the basement. I decided to go first, so I started down the stairs. As I was walking, I suddenly felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around quickly, thinking it was my friend trying to get my attention, but he was several steps behind me. "What's wrong?" he asked. I told him I'd felt something touch my shoulder and that I thought it was him. He denied it and showed me that he was too far behind me to have reached me. At the time, I brushed it off, thinking it must have been my imagination. We made our way down the stairs and continued exploring, chatting about old high school memories to distract ourselves. After a while, we ended up in a long hallway with massive orange pipes running along one side. The pipes were bright and out of place, the most unusual thing in the entire building. By then, we had been there for a while, and I suggested we take a picture for our social media accounts. I told my friend to go first since he was more photogenic than I was. We found an angle we liked, and I snapped the photo. When I looked at the picture, I was puzzled. There was a dark shadow next to my friend that I didn't remember seeing when I took the picture. I thought maybe it was my shadow, but I couldn't make sense of it. I would have noticed if it had been there. My friend then looked at the photo and his expression changed. I could tell something was off, and he asked, "What do you think it is?" We both stared at the image, confused. The shadow seemed out of place, and the unease began to settle in. A feeling of dread washed over us. "Do you think it's a ghost?" I asked. He nodded, and at that moment I knew it was time to leave. I didn't feel safe anymore. Without waiting for him to say anything, I turned and started heading back toward the stairwell. Everything after that was a blur. Before we knew it, we were back in my car, sitting in silence, both of us still processing what had just happened. The air in the car felt different, lighter. We exchanged a few looks but didn't say much. Eventually, I suggested we go grab something to eat to take our minds off the whole thing, and he agreed. Since then, neither of us has really talked about the incident, although I've been meaning to bring it up again. I still keep going back to that photo. I'm convinced that what I captured in that image is the presence of a paranormal entity, and it still creeps me out when I think about it. I've wanted to tell people about this experience for a while, but I'm afraid no one would believe me, which is why I thought I'd share it here. This happened during the summer break after my freshman year of high school in 2017. My mom and I went to visit New York. It hadn't even been a full year since I moved to the US, so my mom wanted to show me some of the famous places in states like New York and New Jersey. I was pretty excited, and my mom showed me around, which was super fun. Around the same time, I had started reading about haunted places in America and creepy stuff like that on different websites. One of the places I'd read about was the Amityville house. I'd heard that they made several movies and wrote a book about it, though I hadn't seen them. So I suggested to my mom that we should check out the Amityville house, since we were in New York and didn't know if we'd come back again. She agreed, and we drove all the way out to Long Island to find the house. When we arrived, I wanted to take pictures and video to show my friends what a scary place we had visited. We got out of the car and started filming. It was a cloudy, dark evening, and the whole place felt eerie, especially when you remember that an entire family was murdered there. There was even a cop car patrolling the neighborhood, and we didn't want to seem like we were doing anything suspicious, so we just took a quick look at the house and then headed back to our hotel. At this point, nothing weird had happened yet. Once we got to the hotel, I started looking at the photos and videos I had taken. One video, in particular, caught my attention. I had zoomed in on the windows of the house, and in one of the frames, I clearly saw something strange, a white, smoke-like substance moving across the window before disappearing. It wasn't a person, and I'm 100% sure there was nothing around that could have caused it. It just appeared, moved around a little, and then vanished. The texture of it looked like smoke, but I'm almost certain it wasn't actual smoke. The best way I can describe it is that it resembled the Japanese floating balls of fire, ghosts known as anabi. At first, I thought I was imagining things, so I showed the video to my mom, and she was genuinely freaked out too. Despite my fascination with the paranormal, I tend to stay skeptical about these things, so I posted the video on my Instagram spam account, just to see if my friends thought it was weird or if they could explain it. A few of my friends DM'd me, saying they saw the same thing and agreed it definitely didn't look like smoke. I was surprised. It seemed like we might have actually caught something paranormal on camera, especially considering all the theories about the Amityville haunting being a hoax. It was unsettling, but I didn't think too much about it after that. I just assumed it was an odd coincidence. However, a year and a half later, I suddenly remembered the video and thought I'd post it on Reddit to see if anyone could explain what happened. So I scrolled through my camera roll looking for it, but it was gone. I even logged into my old spam account to check, but the video wasn't there either. I hadn't changed phones or deleted anything, so I couldn't understand where it went. I asked my mom if she remembered the video, and she definitely did. She even got upset that I had lost it because she felt we had actually captured something truly creepy. I also asked the friends who had seen the post, and they remembered it too, but the video was nowhere to be found. What makes this so hard to believe is that I'm claiming to have video evidence, but now I have nothing to show for it. I really wish I still had it so I could post it here and maybe get an explanation. I'm not sure what to make of it, but I know it was something I'll never forget. Earth is a spiritual realm, and the veil between planes of energy is thin and permeable. Energy bodies move fluidly between worlds. I experience these energies through all of my senses, clairvoyantly, clairaudiently, and clairsentiently. These experiences are rarely by choice. Something occurs, and then, through investigation, I gain a deeper understanding of what I saw, heard, or felt. There came a time when I was naive enough to think I had seen spirit in all its manifestations, shades, lights, orbs. I recall watching The Sixth Sense when it first came out and thinking, great film, but spirit doesn't appear that way. I've changed my mind since. In this multidimensional universe, there are countless types of manifestations, with varying vibrations and intentions. The background of this story is relevant, but I'll keep it brief. This incident took place in rural Putnam County, New York, in 2011. 6 years prior to this event, my marriage came to a sudden and tumultuous end, leaving my life scattered and torn. I had been a stay-at-home parent, published but not yet degreed, and out of the workforce for years. I couldn't find a stable job, and the challenges of poverty were degrading. I lost everything. My ex-husband stopped working and moved in with his boyfriend, and my younger daughter had to live with them. I was in the throes of my older daughter's medically induced addiction to heroin, which had worsened to the point of constant rehabs and emergency room visits. To say my heart was broken is an understatement. I was living in an emotional, upside down, and the separation from my children was a painful experience I don't think I'll ever fully recover from. One early autumn day, seeking solace, I went outside to sit by a rushing stream. I pulled up a chair by the water, hoping to find some peace, and started journaling. I hadn't been sitting there long when I suddenly felt a presence watching me. I glanced up from my book, and there she was, standing on the bridge that crossed the stream, connecting the driveway to the path that led to the house. This entity was unlike anything I had ever seen before. She had no features but was clearly defined in form, a woman, dressed in a Victorian-style gown with a bustle and bonnet, typical of the 1800s. She was a milky, translucent white. I turned my gaze away quickly, hoping she would disappear, but when I looked back, she was still there, lingering much longer than I expected. The intensity of her presence unnerved me. I reminded myself I was safe and tried to brush it off as just another strange experience, thinking it would be a one-time occurrence. About a week later, I was sitting at the computer, searching for work, when I glanced out the window and saw her again. She was across the lawn, by the bridge, pacing anxiously from one side to the other, her arms behind her back. I felt a sudden panic. What was she trying to communicate? Was she there to warn me about something? Was I in danger? Was someone I loved in danger? Her urgency filled me with dread, so I contacted 2 people I trusted for advice. Both suggested I ask her what she wanted. Over the following week, I did just that. I got quiet and put the question out into the universe, hoping for some clarity. Then, one evening, while in my room, I turned around, and she was right there. Half of her body seemed to be in this realm, and the other half was somewhere else. I saw a dark red line down the front of her dress, starting from the middle of her body and stretching downward. It looked like blood, but the line was perfectly straight and contained. To this day, I wonder what it was. This time, she disappeared as quickly as she had appeared. Maybe my fear closed the gap between our worlds, or maybe she had said what she needed to say. I couldn't be sure. But it was my first experience with this type of visitation, and it was only the third time she had appeared. Afterward, I went online and randomly typed in "white lady," because that's what came to mind. I wasn't expecting anything to come up, but when it did, I was shocked and relieved. Apparently, this type of apparition has been seen around the world, particularly in rural areas in the United States, Ireland, and Great Britain. In different countries, the stories vary, but a common thread is the figure of a grieving woman in a white gown, searching for her lost loved ones. In many of these stories, the white lady is said to be the ghost of a mother who lost her daughter or husband, often in tragic circumstances. Some believe she is searching for a lost child, and in some versions, the white lady is said to be aggressive, particularly towards men. I didn't want to frighten anyone, so at first, I didn't mention the ghost to my mother or her husband. But soon, strange things started happening around the house. My mother screamed from the kitchen one day, saying a bowl that had been placed far back on a shelf had flown off and nearly hit her. Another time, while walking outside, a large branch fell from a tree, just missing her and her husband. And there was the strange sound of a metal marble hitting the floor with such force that we all heard it from another room. When we investigated, we found no explanation for the marble's origin. A more profound moment occurred when my younger daughter came for a weekend visit. I went into the bathroom to get washed when she began banging on the door. "Are you okay, Mom?" she asked, sounding worried. I was surprised by her concern. "Yes," I replied. "I'm just getting washed." When I came out of the bathroom, she turned to me and asked again, "Are you sure you're okay?" I told her I was fine, but she looked at me with uncertainty. "Mom, I heard you sobbing," she said. I was stunned. I hadn't been crying, but my daughter had heard me sobbing, though I didn't tell her about the ghost at the time. She was having a clairaudient experience. During the same month, I saw another apparition, this one in full human form. A man in farmer's overalls, covered in dirt, and carrying a tool, passed by my bedroom window at dusk. He looked solid, but moved strangely, as if he didn't quite belong to this world. I got the sense that he had died while working, possibly buried alive due to the dirt that covered him. I watched him disappear into the dusk, and I wondered if there was a connection between him and the white lady, though I couldn't be sure. I later came across a legend about the white lady, which says that she had a daughter who was violently murdered by a farmer. Could this be the connection? I'll never know. The white lady ghost was not just a passing presence. She was full of intent, a powerful force. She wasn't wandering aimlessly, she was purposeful, making noise and showing herself in ways I couldn't ignore. She showed herself to me 3 times, and her grief was so loud that my clairaudient daughter could hear it too. Why did she come to me? I still question this. Did she come to forewarn me about the death of my missing daughter? A year and a half ago, my older daughter died suddenly, just hours before she was supposed to be released from the hospital. I can't help but wonder if the white lady is the embodiment of millions of grieving mothers, their souls spinning through time and space so intensely that they take form. Whatever or whoever she is, I know one thing for sure: she walks the earth.